This is Audible.
Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Shadow over the Fens by Joy Ellis. Narrated by Henrietta Meir. Chapter 1. As Detective Inspector Nikki Galena locked the door of her Fenland home, a shiver of anticipation coursed through her. She gazed across the wide expanse of remote marsh, took a deep savouring breath of the fresh, salty air, and smiled. It felt good to be back where she belonged. Across Cloud Fen she could see the mist clearing, and a green gold morning slowly waking up the salt marsh with its bright, clear light. She stepped into the garden, and wondered what this new dawn would bring with it. Apart from the arrival of her new sergeant, her smile widened. She had been waiting for this moment for a while, and it was something she both welcomed and dreaded. Detective Sergeant Joseph Easter was joining her CID team. It was also his first day back after being injured on duty. She had no illusions that his new position would be a breeze, because it wouldn't be. It would be a testing time for both of them. She just hoped that he was as match fit as he claimed to be. Nikki crunched her way across the gravel drive to her car and muttered a small prayer of thanks that for once the Nick was unusually quiet. At least she wouldn't be throwing the poor sod straight in at the deep end.
"At last, Nikki, I was beginning to think I'd never see you again."
A tall, craggy-faced man, wearing tracksuit bottoms, a bright red rugby shirt, and a black rucksack, brought his bike to a halt, hurriedly climbed off, and grinned warmly at her.
"Martin, how have you been?"
Nikki welcomed the friendly hug, then pushed him back and stared at him.
"Hey, you look good."
She had known him for more years than she cared to remember. He was her closest neighbour, even though he lived some quarter of a mile away down a narrow track that led onto the marsh. The man beamed at her.
"I'm fine, but all the better for hearing your news. I've seen the workmen out here for a few weeks now. They told me that you were planning on moving back."
"It was time to come home, Martin." As Nikki spoke those words, she knew it was true. She'd been gone too long, stuck in the town, spending every waking hour hunting down drug dealers. She had driven herself on until she could barely remember what life was like before her drug-crushing crusade had eaten into every part of her existence.
"Glad to hear it."
Martin Durham brushed a swath of wavy iron-grey hair from his eyes and looked up appreciatively at her old farmhouse. Fresh paint glistened in the morning sunlight.
"Nice job. The weather out here takes no prisoners. I was beginning to wonder if the east wind was going to claim it before you."
"It was in a bit of a state, wasn't it?" She suddenly felt horribly guilty for neglecting her old family home for so long. "But this winter, I promise you'll see smoke rising from the chimney again." She glanced at her watch. "Oh, Lord, I'm sorry to dash off, but the Fenland Constabulary calls. Why don't you come round for a coffee at the weekend? We can catch up."
"Thanks, I'll do that. Actually, I've got a little bit of interesting news for you, but it can wait till then. Oh, and—"
He looked at her weather-beaten front gate.
"I see your workmen didn't get as far as this. I was going to give my fences a coat of wood preserver tomorrow. I'll do this at the same time if it helps."
"Great, if it's no trouble." Nikki clicked the central locking on her car. "But be sure to let me know what I owe you. That stuff costs a fortune."
"I don't think one gate will break the bank. Consider it as a welcome home present."
With a wave, he climbed back on his bike, hauled his rucksack up over his shoulder, and pedalled off in the direction of his cottage. Nikki slid into her car, leaned back, and allowed herself a long sigh of relief. It had not been an easy decision to return home, but then her last case had changed a lot of things in her life. Now, having had some time to reflect, she knew it had thrown her a lifeline. Her vigilante-style one-woman mission to clean Greenborough of drugs had nearly cost her her career, and was beginning to turn her into the most blinkered and disliked officer in the area. And that was not the kind of woman she wanted to be. Just meeting Martin again made her realize just how thoughtful people could be. Maybe the whole world was not populated by evil shits after all. As the tall figure in the scarlet shirt slowly disappeared from view, she felt a kind of peace wash over her. It was really good to be back. She belonged here in this strange and remote water world, with its great stretches of marshland teeming with wildlife, and with a big, big sky hanging over everything. With one final glance up at the old house, she turned the key in the ignition and pulled out onto the lane. At last, she was ready and willing to take on whatever Greenborough Nick decided to chuck at her. It was going to be a good day. As Nikki began her drive from Cloud Fen, Joseph Easter touched his fingertips on the turquoise-tiled wall of the pool and burst through the surface of the sparkling water. 50 lengths, nowhere near the distance he used to do, but he was getting there. He stood for a moment getting his breath back. Every day showed improvement. He could now do a pretty impressive 10 miles on the hardest program on the exercise bike without too much pain. He lay on his back and floated for a while, and it wasn't even pain anymore, well, nothing like what he had suffered just after the operation. He glanced at the clock. He didn't want to be late on his first day at his new station. He swam easily back to the steps and pulled himself reluctantly from the warm pool. Until today, he had spent almost 2 hours every morning in the club gym and the small pool, doing all he could to get strong enough to pass the medical that would let him return to work. Joseph padded into the changing room, collected his towel and toilet bag from his locker, and went for a shower. The FMO had grudgingly allowed him back, with a few reservations about what duties he should avoid for a while, but all in all, it had been a pretty good outcome. His only worry was that although his body was recovering, he had no way of knowing how his mind would react to an unexpected situation. And he wouldn't know that until the next time the shit hit the fan. He could test his muscles and his physical endurance, but as far as he knew, there was no simple test for his mental state, which meant there was little point in worrying about it. He was finally free to join D.I. Galena's team, so he'd better just get on with it. He grinned to himself as the soapy water cascaded down his back. Into the lion's den. As he rubbed shampoo into his mop of light brown hair, he remembered his first meeting with his new boss. Instead of welcoming him to his temporary assignment, she had been acid-tongued, short-tempered, and bloody rude. Joseph laughed aloud, then stuck his head under the stream of hot water. Because despite all of that, he had liked her. Well, maybe like was not the right word, but he had recognized a dedicated, honest copper beneath the hard-as-nails exterior. He could not have been more delighted when she asked him to leave his old Nick and work with her permanently at Greenborough. He towed himself down and dressed. Somewhere during that last case that they had worked together, they had forged some sort of unspoken bond. He had felt it, and he was pretty sure that she had too. Why else would she have requested that he transfer from Fenchester? Joseph dried his hair and stared at himself in the mirror. He didn't look different, but he knew that deep down he had changed. He looked at his reflection. In his eyes he saw the same old intensity, although maybe there was something else there now. He forced a grin to banish the gloomy mood that was threatening to wash over him. Maybe it was just that the locker room mirror needed cleaning. Joseph gathered up his kit, pushed it in his gym bag, and walked down the corridor to the foyer, thinking as he went about his new position. He wasn't daft enough to believe that working with D.I. Galena would be easy. As individuals, they were complete opposites, but somehow their varied approaches brought them, by different avenues, to the same conclusions, and that would catch them villains. As the automatic doors sighed back, he smiled to himself. They had all the right ingredients to make a damn good team. His expression darkened, just as long as they both allowed the past to stay where it belonged and not creep into the present. Sunshine warmed Joseph's face as he stepped outside, and his smile returned. This was not the time for raking up old garbage. Today was all about fresh starts, and if he didn't get a wriggle on, his first words from his new governor would be a rollicking for being late. He loped across the car park, unlocked his boot, and threw his bag inside. As he closed it again, he noticed someone give him a friendly wave. He lifted his hand automatically, then walked around and got into the driver's seat. The other early morning swimmer was a dark-haired woman who he had seen briefly a few times before. She was thin, but not in a skinny way. She looked lean and core-fit like an athlete. He paused and watched her make her way towards the club entrance. Her stride was confident, and her limbs moved with a graceful fluidity. Joseph found himself staring unashamedly through the windscreen at her, and for a man who had always believed that looks were not the only thing that mattered, it came as something of a shock. There was definitely something very attractive about the woman's appearance. Joseph shook himself. He'd never been late for work in his entire life, and he didn't intend to start today. With an annoyed snort, he started the engine, released the handbrake, and sped noisily from the car park, but not before one last glance in his mirror to watch the dark-haired woman disappear into the building. He had not been sure what to expect from the team, but Joseph's entrance into the CID room was accompanied by a rowdy chorus of cheers and an assortment of handshakes and backslapping. "Great to see you again, Sarge." DC Cat Cullen's grin almost sliced her face in two. "Love the hair." Joseph stared wide-eyed at the short blonde spikes and the emerald-green Mohican-style strip that ran from her forehead to the nape of her neck. "Yeah, cool, isn't it? The governor's had me getting down and dirty with some of Greenborough's youth, on a covert surveillance case, you understand." "I'm never quite sure with you, Cat. Your disguises suit you a bit too well." "Sarge, how are you?" The big form of Dave Harris muscled in and grasped his hand, pumping it up and down with ferocious delight. "Doing well, my friend, and happy to be here, I can tell you. There are only so many old movies you want to watch." "So, you really have decided to join us at last, Detective Sergeant." Nikki Galena's voice instantly quelled the chit-chat. Joseph had not even noticed her come in. "Yes, Ma'am, but only on the condition that our next case is considerably less injurious than the last one." A pained look passed swiftly across her face, then the inspector shrugged her shoulders. "There are no guarantees in this line of work, Joseph. Let's just hope that lightning doesn't strike twice, shall we?" She threw him a rare smile and held out her hand. "Welcome to the team. We are glad to have you on board." The room rippled with comments of agreement, and as Joseph gripped her hand in his, he felt a lump form in his throat. He'd worked with this small group of people for such a short time on his assignment, but they were already his trusted comrades. That was what that kind of case did to you, brought you close together, and tied you with the tightest bonds. With difficulty, he tried to formulate a reply, but the words would not come. "Okay, you lot," the governor saved him. "Fun and games over, bugger off and catch me some criminals." She studied him carefully, and he wondered what she was thinking. "Coffee and a chat in my office sounds good to me. You're buying." D.I. Galena turned and marched out of the CID room, and Joseph smiled to himself. He'd heard that she had mellowed, and wondered how such a metamorphosis could have been achieved. Now he knew. It was subtle. She still yelled at everyone, but there was just the hint of a twinkle in her eye now. The Ice Maiden was still very much in charge, but there was the slightest melting, a softening around the edges, and it suited her. As he scurried obediently off to the coffee machine, the smile remained on his face. Behind the closed doors of her office, Nikki allowed the facade to fall away. "Good to have you back, Joseph. There were a few moments back there when I wondered—" The rest went unsaid. "You and me both, Mom." Joseph took a deep breath and held it for a while. Then he slowly exhaled and said, "But here we are again. And this time as a fully paid-up member of the team." Nikki sipped her coffee. "Are you going to move into the town?" "Not sure yet, Mom. I want to get it right, not just grab the first thing that comes along." He pushed his hand through his hair and leaned back in his chair. "I feel kind of different since I came out of hospital. I think I'll stick it out at the B&B for a while. My room's not too bad, and I'm actually getting sort of attached to Mrs. Blakely's 1960s retro style of decoration." Nikki nodded. "Probably a wise move not to rush things." "Yes, I think I'll get my flat in Fenchester on the market, then when it sells, sit on the money until I'm ready to make a move." "Well, if you get stuck, you can store whatever you want out at Cloud Cottage Farm. Apart from the house itself, I've got some pretty useful outbuildings, and they're all dry and secure." "Thanks, Mom. I may take you up on that." He looked at her hopefully. "So, anything interesting going down in CID?" "Before I fill you in on our work status, I need to say one thing." She leant forward. "I'll bring the subject up only once, then it's going to be business as usual, okay?" She didn't give him a chance to reply, but hurried on. "If anything bothers you, or if anything is too strenuous, I want you to be perfectly honest with me, and we'll find a way around it. I want no big hero stuff and no being a martyr either. Got it?" Joseph nodded reluctantly. "Loud and clear, Gov. But honestly, I've not spent weeks in physio in the gym getting myself fit to go and mess it all up in my first week back. He flashed those infuriatingly sincere eyes at her, and Nikki was forced to believe him. Right, lecture over. Any questions? Can't think of any, although I'm delighted to see Dave Harris is with CID now. He sailed through the interview board, I'm glad to say. His experience and local knowledge are a great asset. Joseph nodded. Plus, he's a really good bloke. So, what are we working on at present, Mom? Nothing heavy, unless you count the mountain of paperwork that the last month generated. She grimaced, then pulled a thin file across the desk. Frankly, we're about as quiet as I can remember. She opened the folder. A spate of small fires, most likely arson. Kids. We thought so, but now we're not so sure. The last one took out a lock-up at the back of the big garage on Monk Street. It was lucky that Trompton got there smartish, or there could have been a major incident, what with dozens of motors and the petrol reservoirs. Joseph frowned. What makes you say it's not kids? The fire investigation officer said an accelerant had been used, but he swears it wasn't just bored jobs. He said there was a professional feel to it. A serious fire starter does not bode well, Mom. Nikki nodded. I know, but that was 2 weeks ago. 3 fires in as many nights, and now it's gone quiet. I don't know whether to be relieved or worried. She closed the folder. Other than that, Kat and Dave are working on a cannabis farm investigation, but they're pretty close to a conclusion. Then we have all the usual suspects. Car ringing, break-ins, the ever-present drug trafficking, a bit of fraud, but nothing worthy of mention. So basically it's same old, other than the fires. Joseph stretched. And which one of those tasty delights have you got lined up for me, Mom? Actually, it's none of them. She sighed. Well, not just yet, anyway. You're with me for a few days. What kind of investigation? There isn't one. She exhaled and wondered how to explain her latest problem. The super wants us to help him. The auditors are in, and apart from drowning in a sea of paperwork, some faceless civilian in a comfy office has decided that our area is way over and above the national average for sudden deaths. She leant forward and rested her elbows on the desk. They're scared shitless that the media will get hold of the statistics and have a field day with them. The super wants them checked, and fast. Joseph looked perplexed. But what's that got to do with us? It's a medical issue, surely. I thought that to start with, but as I looked deeper, I realised that it's not just sudden deaths, where the doctor signs a certificate and that's that. There's an awful lot of occasions where we've classed them as suspicious deaths and involve forensics. To what outcome? Showing up as suicides mainly, and although it's nowhere near the level seen a while ago in Wales, it's still unsettling. I thought the suicide rates were falling in the UK. That's what the government statistics office says. In fact, a few years back, the east of England was reported to have one of the lowest rates in England and Wales. I think that's maybe why our figures stood out like a bloody beacon. Joseph frowned. Is there any particular age group or gender involved in these figures? Nikki shook her head slowly. No, and I'm at a loss to find any kind of common denominator amongst them. She finished her coffee, then said, Sorry, I know this is not CID work, but Superintendent Bainbridge really needs us to help him find some answers for his little bureaucrat. Joseph shrugged. Then let's do it. It's not too depressing for you, is it? All things considered. He smiled warmly at her, and she understood why there were so many cow-eyed women dribbling their way around the station today. I'm fine with it, Mom. In fact, I'm so glad to be alive, it's actually a pretty good assignment for me. If I were depressed, then maybe not, but... Her phone rang and interrupted Joseph. It was harassed Nick Bainbridge. She listened to what he had to say, murmured her assent, and hung up. Gotta go. The super wants an update on my findings so far. She gave him a rueful smile. Such as they are. Oh, and he sends his regards, and his apologies for not getting down to see you, but I suspect that the auditor may have nailed him to his desk. She handed Joseph a sheaf of papers. Copies of everything I've managed to dig up. See what you think, and we'll toss some ideas around when I get back. Joseph trawled through the articles for over an hour, and as he did, his upbeat mood began to disappear. He'd been in some pretty dark places in his life, maybe a lot more than most, but he had never considered taking his own life. Now, as he read reports from a myriad of agencies and help organizations, he was sickened to realize just how many people actually did. The figures seemed staggering. One suicide in the UK every 82 minutes? Surely that couldn't be right. He placed the paper down and stared at it. And why should the Greenborough area be worse than any other? He frowned. Maybe it wasn't. Figures could be manipulated to fit any given situation, and although stats were not his favourite pastime, he was quite good with them. So, in the absence of any proper police work, perhaps he should spend some time hunting out anomalies or grey areas that had been engineered to represent something other than what they really were. With a small sigh, Joseph opened a second folder and removed the sheets of statistics. Suddenly, those old movies that he had become so fed up with recently were actually starting to look really good. Chapter 2. Charles Cavendish Small pointed upwards dramatically. "And this, ladies, gentlemen, and children, is the high spot of our tour." He paused, hoping that for once someone would understand the pun. They rarely did, and he wondered why he bothered. "The Tower. It was built in 3 stages, beginning with Early English and ending in Perpendicular. Historically, each stage represents the growing wealth of our town, and from the viewing platform you will get a most rewarding and magnificent view across Greenborough, the river, the surrounding fens, and out to the wash." The guide stepped lightly across the stone floor, careful to avoid walking on the memorial stones, and indicated towards an archway. "If you would like to climb the steps, please follow me. But be warned, they are steep, and they are the only route up to the tower. There are small side recesses to wait in should others be using the steps to descend." He glanced around at his small party. They all looked pretty healthy, although 2 of the old dears from the history group would be soaking their knees in Radox for a few days afterwards. Nothing too awful had ever happened on his tours, but his fellow guide Arthur had had to cope with 2 panic attacks and a severely twisted ankle in just 1 weekend last summer. "If anyone is in any doubt about their ability to climb or has blood pressure or heart problems, please wait here, or feel free to go to the church cafe for a drink. We should be approximately half an hour. Thank you." With a slightly theatrical flourish, he swept his charges towards the screened archway. "Follow me, and take great care. We don't want any accidents." There had been the usual gasps of amazement when the group stepped into the viewing area and looked out across the great tapestry of the flatlands, and today the visibility was particularly good. Clear, bright blue sky, white fluffy clouds, and a golden sun. Charles sometimes looked at his visitors with less than delight, but he loved his beautiful parish church, and he loved this magical view across the county. On days like today, you could see as far as the Norfolk coast. He did a quick head count, assured himself that no one had been left gasping on the stairs, and began to identify various landmarks. "Please, what is that?" asked a foreign tourist with a heavy Germanic accent. Charles followed the pointing finger and smiled. "That is the ruin of the Fenland Abbey of St. Cecilia. Little is left except that wonderful high arch and the remains of the chapel." "And is that the docks?" asked one of a small party of schoolchildren, pointing to a series of cranes. "Absolutely, young man. This end for the fishing boats, and the new part is the port for Greenborough. And oh yes, if you look towards the estuary, you can just see the masts of a cargo ship making her way towards the Wayland River." People pointed, took photographs, and generally chatted amongst themselves, all agreeing it was certainly worth the climb. Charles let them enjoy the view for a while, then began to organize their descent. "Right, if we are all ready, I'll—" He paused at the top of the stone stairwell and looked down pensively. It should be clear. There were no more tours today. He listened again, but someone was definitely on their way up, and pretty quickly at that. "Sorry, folks, can you all just stand back for a moment? There's someone—" Before he could finish, he was elbowed firmly in the solar plexus and found himself doubled over on the floor, gasping for breath. "Hey, you can't—" A face, contorted beyond anything that Charles had ever seen, hung over him. The man had burst through the opening from the stairs and scattered the little group like ninepins. Now he was suspended over Charles like a hideous gargoyle from the ancient architecture that had somehow come to life and was bent on devouring him. Pure, mind-numbing fear kept Charles a prisoner, then a terrified scream from one of the youngsters broke the spell. This had to be a panic attack, but if it was, it had to be the very worst kind, and if he didn't calm the man, and damned quickly, someone was going to get hurt. The last thing Charles needed was a frenzied dash for the stairs.
"Keep calm, everyone. It's okay. Really?" he gasped. "Let me help you."
He held out his hand to the man.
"Please, sit down here with me. Come on, you can do it."
For a second, Charles thought he had got through. Then, with a strangled scream, a sound that Charles would hear every night for years to come, the man turned and ran to the high stone balustrade, climbed up onto the ledge, and without a moment's hesitation, threw himself over. Silence engulfed them all. Then one of the children began to whimper, and Charles scrambled to his feet and rushed to look over the wall. A couple of the group appeared at his shoulder, while others took the children and tried to calm them. All Charles could do was stare down at the broken figure below them. The man had fallen the equivalent of 9 floors before hitting the wall that flanked the waterway. To Charles's horror, as they looked on helplessly, the lifeless body slid slowly from the wall and dropped like a sack of unwanted rubbish into the sluggish tidal waters of the Wayland River. Chapter 3.
"Mom?"
Nikki closed the superintendent's door and looked up to see Joseph hurrying down the corridor towards her.
"Sergeant Conway has just asked me to tell you that there's been an incident. I'm afraid we have a jumper."
Nikki's heart sank.
"Not the multi-story car park again?"
Joseph shook his head.
"St. Saviour's Tower."
"Hellfire! When did this happen?"
"Uniform have only just had the shout, Gov. The duty sergeant said if you wanted to attend, he wouldn't deploy another senior officer."
"Tell him we're on our way, then meet me in the yard. I'll go pick up my keys from the office." A blue and white cordon had been put across the entrance to the church grounds, and Nikki could see uniformed police officers posted at the entrances and footpaths. A cluster of people were gathered by the main church door. Some sat on the steps, and others paced nervously up and down the path. A WPC was talking with them and had her arm tightly around a child of about 8 or 9. 3 more youngsters sat huddled close together on a low wall, close to where the policewoman stood. Nikki took in the pale faces, slack mouths and wide, frightened eyes, and to her distress, realized that the children must have witnessed the fall.
"Over here, Mom."
Joseph indicated towards a small group of figures leaning over the river wall.
"The doctor's there, and it looks like Yvonne and Niall must have been first on scene."
Nikki felt relief to see WPC Yvonne Collins and PC Niall Farrow in attendance. They were a crew that she had something of a liking for. They had worked with her on several occasions, and she thought that the older woman and the younger man made a good combination.
"What have we got here?"
she asked.
"White male, Ma'am. Jump from the viewing platform."
Niall stared up at the tower almost disbelievingly.
"Into the river?"
"No, Inspector." The doctor, a usually jovial man, who carried a little too much weight around his girth and was healthy for him, turned and approached them.
"Hit the wall first, I'm afraid. Snapped his back like a dry twig. You can tell by the way he's lying." "He's out of the water, then?"
asked Joseph.
The doctor nodded. "Sort of. It's a bit difficult to see him from here. He went in but immediately drifted into the mud around a submerged derelict boat. The tide's on its way out, so he'll be going nowhere."
"Have you been down there, Doctor?"
"Yes, close enough to check everything that I needed to, but you'll need a few strong backs to get him out, I can tell you."
He brushed mud from his trouser legs.
"And yes, before you ask, he is most certainly dead."
"Well, we'd better take a look, Sergeant." Nikki walked towards the wall.
"Mum?"
Yvonne Collins followed her. "Forgive me for sticking my oar in, but will forensics be taking some photos before they get him brought up?"
Nikki frowned. "It's the usual procedure. What's bothering you, Constable?"
"I don't know, Mum, but I'm sure this isn't straightforward. Yes, he jumped. There are 15 witnesses to testify to that, but—" She paused, then looked directly at Nikki. "They all say he was either scared to death of something or someone, or he was completely off his head. Sane, rational people don't often throw themselves from high buildings, Yvonne." "But the children, Mom. I keep thinking about the children." Yvonne held her stare. "Determined suicides, those who plan to jump, are usually very deliberate and very organized. They would never pick a time when the platform was full of tourists and little kids now, would they?" Nikki groaned inwardly to think of children witnessing such a horrible thing.
"Then he had to be high on something. Oh, hell, poor choice of words. But he must have been wasted to do a thing like that."
"Probably was, but
When you talk to the witnesses, I think you'll agree that there is a very odd feel about this, Mom. Okay, I hear what you say and I trust your intuition, but before I do anything, I need to go see this poor sod for myself. Niall will help you down, Mom. There's some slippery steps, and believe me, they're lethal. Then you have to hang over a narrow ledge, an old walkway of some kind. Our man is in the mud that's dredged into the bottom of that old boat. It took a few minutes to get down to the water level, and Niall steadied her as she leaned around the slimy brickwork of the ledge. I can see her— Nikki's words froze in her throat, and her mouth dried to chaff. Lying in the reddish-brown river mud, his body impossibly twisted, and his face half submerged in a brackish puddle of water, was a man she knew. Her mind flashed up a picture from earlier that day, a man in a scarlet rugger shirt and dark jog pants, a man waving happily as he rode off home, the man who had just offered to paint her gate. Martin? Her voice crackled with emotion. Oh, no! You know him? Joseph moved to her side, his hand on her shoulder. Gov? Nikki shrank back away from the water, but the sight of the filthy scarlet shirt stayed with her. He's my neighbour. He was coming for coffee at the weekend. She knew the word sounded crass, but it was all she could think of. They were going to catch up. That's what she'd said. Joseph exhaled loudly, and when she turned to him, his expression was full of concern. It's okay. It's okay. Nikki gathered herself. This was a seemingly impossible thing to happen. Martin had seemed so— she tried to find the right word— so normal. Who is he, Mom? Asked Niall softly. Nikki straightened up and took a deep breath. She might be a hardened police officer, but a shock was still a shock. It was just that she knew how to deal with her emotions quicker than others. Martin Durham of Knott Cottage, Buckledyke Lane, Cloud Fen. He lives alone on the edge of the marsh. As far as I know, there is only his sister to notify. Both his parents are dead and he was unmarried. The sister's name is Elizabeth. She lives with her partner somewhere in Old Bolingbroke. She turned to the police constable. And I want to be the one to go out to his cottage. Sergeant Easter and I will go directly after we've finished here. Yes, Mom. I'll radio it in straight away. Niall Farrow scrambled back up the wet steps to where his crewmate waited. Nikki stared from the greenish waters of the River Wayland up to where WPC Yvonne Collins was leaning over the wall, her hand outstretched to Niall. Yvonne's keen policeman's nose had been right. Maybe something terrible in Martin's life had driven him to kill himself, but he would never have done it in such a manner to cause suffering to others, especially children. She might not know him intimately, but she knew him better than most. Right, well, we'd better get Soko down here, then let uniform to sort out recovery. She looked intently at Joseph. I am going to be so interested in what the post-mortem shows, especially the toxicology report. Chapter 4. As Nikki drove the familiar marsh lanes towards Cloud Fen, she knew that something had changed forever. Knott Cottage had always been simply Martin's place. That was what the local villagers called it. Half of them would be hard-pressed to tell you its postal address. So what was this guy like? Asked Joseph. Dependable. Help anyone. Loved the marshes. Nikki saw a picture in her mind of her peeling and weather-beaten garden gate, and wasn't sure if she'd ever have the heart to get it painted again. But a bit of a loner. She frowned. Not really. Yes, he lived alone and he didn't talk about himself much, but he joined in with village stuff, and he was a regular at the Wild Goose. Forgive me for saying, but where exactly is this village you keep mentioning? Nikki smiled and slowed down as a long-eared hare bounded out into the lane ahead of her. Ah, well, Cloud Fen village is kind of scattered, and there's not much of it anyway. It's like so many of these outlying communities. The cottages are few and far between. The post office that doubled for the corner shop was closed years ago, and all that's left is the chapel, with a service every third Sunday in the month, and the Wild Goose. She watched as the hare dashed off into one of the great potato fields that edged the road. Frankly, we are lucky to still have the pub, the way things are going. It is kind of yokelish, isn't it? Careful, town boy. You're talking about the place where I was born. Sorry. Joseph hung his head in mock shame. Do we go past your place? Cloud Cottage Farm? No, we turn off just before it. But you can see it from Martin's. It's only a short way back across the marsh. I wonder what will happen to the cottage. Nikki wondered too.
but before she could answer, her radio call sign blared out.
A silver Suzuki Grand Vitara 4x4 registered to Martin Durham has been found abandoned not far from the church, ma'am. Abandoned? Seems that way, ma'am. We've had reports of the same car being driven erratically a few minutes prior to Durham entering the church. One witness says it looked as though he were having some kind of seizure, contorted face and all that.
Nikki slowed to negotiate a corner, then said,
OK, just get the car to the pound and secure it. I may need a Soko to check it out for me. Thanks, over and out.
Nikki relayed what had been said to Joseph, and for the next 5 minutes they drove in silence, until she pulled the car into Buckledyke Lane.
Wow, what a place to live,
exclaimed Joseph, then added quickly,
and I mean that in a good, if somewhat remote sort of way.
He stared across the vast expanse of marshland to the distant horizon that shimmered and sparkled like a strip of silver foil.
You should see it at sunrise, said Nikki softly.
My childhood bedroom looked in this direction, and my father told me I was truly blessed to wake to this sight every day. I never really appreciated it when I was 5, but now I know he was right.
The cottage looks very neat, Gov. Are we going to have to force an entry?
Nikki threw him a withering look. This is Cloud Fen, 2 up, 2 down cottage, Sergeant. We turn the handle and open the door, and if he's actually locked it for some reason, the key will be under the doormat.
You don't lock your doors?
Asked Joseph in amazement. She began to walk slowly up the path to the front door. I do these days, but then a farmhouse may be considered fair game for rich pickings. Not that there are any, but the thieves wouldn't know that until they got in. I think it's being a copper. I feel it my duty to think about security.
And the flak would be pretty heavy if your colleagues knew you went out and left the place wide open.
There is that, of course. She arrived at the door, then veered off right along a narrow path and went round to the back. No one uses front doors out here. She smiled. If you're going to tread mud in, do it in the kitchen, not the best room. She moved slowly across the backyard, then paused. She'd been in here so many times that she knew exactly what she would find, even before she opened the door.
Shall I? Asked Joseph. This can't be very pleasant for you.
No, I'm fine. It just seems so odd. I'm having trouble getting my head round it.
Maybe he will have left a note. That may explain things better.
Nikki shrugged. Somehow, she knew there would be no note, just a mystery, and even if it never became a police matter, it would be one she would have to solve.
The door was unlocked. Surely, if you were going to go out, never to come back, you'd lock the door, mused Joseph, half to himself.
Would it matter? If things meant so little and you wanted to die, would you care? They stepped into the quarry-tiled floor of the kitchen, and a feeling of warmth greeted them, partly because the place was a little time warp of old country living, clean, fresh and welcoming, and partly because a heavy iron pot was simmering gently on the solid fuel stove. Joseph looked at Nikki and bit his lip.
I don't think we are going to reason our way out of that one, do you, Gov?
She didn't answer. Something had happened to Martin Durham between the time that he had spoken to her and his fateful trip to St. Saviour's Tower. Something devastating. You take the ground floor, Joseph. I'll check upstairs.
Are you looking for anything in particular, Gov?
Just a good reason for a sane, happy man to top himself.
Oh, simple then.
Nikki climbed the stairs. She had only been to the upper floor once before. It must have been many years ago, because her daughter Hannah was still coming home on the school bus, and she'd been keeping an eye open for the familiar blue and white coach that stopped at the end of Buckledyke Lane. Martin had picked up some kind of bug, but had been too proud to ask for help. She had had a bad feeling that all was not well, and called in. Lucky she had. An hour later, an ambulance was tearing towards Greenborough General with a blue light flashing. The main bedroom was like the rest of the cottage, well cared for, and although a little basic, with old wood floors and heavy plain wood furniture, it was clear that the man loved his tiny home. There was just one photograph on his bedside table, 2 smiling women, arms around each other's shoulders, one very much like him, and the other considerably younger, with a cheeky grin. Elizabeth and Jana. Nikki picked it up and shook her head. She'd better look for his address book and get Elizabeth's number. Even if uniform had already traced her, Nikki knew her well enough to want to offer her condolences. She replaced the frame exactly where it had sat and stared at the woman's face. I have a feeling that you aren't going to know any more about this than I do, she thought. This death was not planned.
Gov, Joseph called up the stairs. "There are an awful lot of prescription drugs in a cabinet down here. I think you should take a look at them." "On my way." Nikki slid open the drawer in the bedside table. Neat lines of tablet boxes filled the space. "Oh, shit." She closed the drawer and went to see what Joseph had found. "I'd say this guy was very ill, wouldn't you, Mum?" Joseph was standing in a small shower room that Martin had obviously had built onto the back of the cottage and was pointing to the interior of a large glass-fronted cabinet. Without even looking closely, Nikki knew that the stacks of boxes were from a pharmaceutical company. "Are they all legitimately his?" "The labels are all marked up Martin Durham." "Then you're right. He must have been very poorly. But he never said a thing." "Which could explain a lot. Maybe he just went into town for a hospital appointment and got really bad news. News that he just couldn't handle." Why couldn't she believe that? It was a perfectly logical suggestion. "Check it out, Joseph, and go out to the car and get some evidence bags. We'll need these." She pointed to the boxes. "Do any of the drugs mean anything to you?" "There are a lot of antibiotics, Mom. Penicillin and amoxicillin, but I'm afraid the others mean nothing." Joseph knelt down and studied them. This man was clearly reliant on medication big style. "We'll have to talk to his GP and get his hospital notes released." Nikki watched Joseph go out and looked around the familiar old sitting room. In the past, they'd sat around the open fire, drunk hot chocolate and played Scrabble, Martin, Hannah and herself. Hannah had always liked him. She would be very sad if she knew what had happened, but Nikki would not be telling her. Her precious daughter was in a coma, and when Nikki talked to her, she told her only happy things. "Shall I bag them all, or one of each kind, Mom?" Joseph broke her reverie. "Bag them all. And there are more upstairs beside the bed. Get them too. Was there any post, by the way?" "Nothing recent. A bit of junk mail and a bill or two." "Bank statement?" "No. And his writing desk, unlike the door, is locked, and I couldn't find a key." Nikki looked around. Had she ever seen Martin at the desk? Maybe. Where would he hide a key? Nikki looked inside a vase, moved a few books, then shook her head. "His sister may know. If not, I'm afraid we'll have to force it open. Meanwhile, and until I've spoken to Elizabeth, I'm going to secure the cottage. We may have to get a team in to check it out, but your serious illness theory may close this case without further investigation." Joseph nodded, but unenthusiastically. "You're not convinced, are you?" Nikki puffed out her cheeks and shook her head. "It may have a bearing on it, but no matter how bad the news that he received was—" Like Yvonne, she was thinking about the children. He simply could not have done it in the way that he did. "But he did do it, Mom." "Yes, he did, Joseph. And we have to find out why." Chapter 5. "Sorry, but it all looks pretty straightforward to me, Nikki." Superintendent Rick Bainbridge leant back in his chair and stared at her. "He must have been so doped up that he didn't realize there were people already up on the viewing platform. If he were out of his head, he may not have even seen them." "He saw them all right, sir. WPC Collins has given me the statements that she collected. Everyone said he appeared terrified or something, and one little lad said that Martin was afraid of them, especially the tour guide, when he held his hand out to him to help him." The superintendent shrugged. "Well, I don't know what to deduce from that comment, if anything. The poor little kid was probably traumatized, and it must have happened so quickly it's a wonder anyone had time to take note of anything." "Actually, the witnesses were unusually consistent in their statements, sir," said Nikki testily, "and I would not disregard what the boy said. Children can be very perceptive." Rick Bainbridge threw her a worried look. "I think maybe you're a bit too close to this, Inspector. If it needs investigation, and I hope for a budget's sake that it doesn't, I'll give it to one of the other teams." "I'm fine, honestly, Super." Nikki tried to keep her voice neutral, even though she was anxious not to lose the investigation. "And there's little we can do until the tox screen comes back. I'll just check out the usual avenues while we wait. There may have been money worries or some personal issues that, along with the heavy medication, just triggered something. The coroner is going to want everything we can get together for the inquest." "Okay, stick with it for now, but don't forget, people aren't always what they seem. He may have been a good neighbour, but just how well did you really know him? Don't forget, you'd been living in the town for almost a year before you went back to Cloud Fen. Things change. People change." Nikki nodded. "You're right, sir. And don't worry, I'll check everything as I would any other suspicious death. I won't get phobic over it." She threw him what she hoped was a sincere smile and said, "Maybe I'm just sensitive to this because of those statistics you've got me working on." It was the super's turn to agree. "Ah, yes, at best they don't make easy reading. Then this happens to a friend. It's understandable. Just don't look for things that aren't there." "Of course not, sir. So, if that's all—" Yes, go. I have to get back to the damned auditor anyway. Just keep me up to speed, Inspector." Outside the door, Nikki heaved a sigh of relief. She would have to tread warily and endeavour to hold her tongue a little more. Her gut instinct screamed that something was horribly wrong about Martin Durham's death. Something so wrong that she couldn't even bring herself to say the word suicide. Whatever, she would get to the bottom of it, and the easiest route was to keep the investigation closely under her control. Joseph looked up as the boss came back into the CID room. "How did it go, Gov?" The DI raised her eyebrows. "In professional terms, Sergeant, I nearly screwed up." She flopped into a chair. "He reckons I'm too close. I only just managed to convince him to leave it with me, but I'm going to play things closer to my chest in future." Joseph nodded. "Well, you've just had a call from Elizabeth Durham. She is devastated, but she wants to talk to you. I said we'd call on her first thing tomorrow morning, if that's okay." "Absolutely. Did you get the full address?" Joseph glanced at his notebook. "Yes, Mom. Monk's Lodge. I've got directions." "Good. We'll go immediately after the morning briefing." "So, what can I do now?" asked Joseph. "I've got some paperwork that won't wait another day, so perhaps you would ring Martin's GP and go have a word with her. I'm pretty sure he saw Dr. Helen Latimer. Her practice covers most of Cloud Fen. Her surgery is in Churchgate. The number is in the book." "I'm on to it, Mom." Helen Latimer confirmed that she was Martin's doctor, and she reluctantly consented to see him before her 4 p.m. surgery began, as long as he could get there in time. He checked his watch, quickly calculated how long their earlier trip to Cloud Fen had taken, and decided it should give him at least 20 minutes with the GP. Just enough time if he got a move on. As he grabbed his jacket and car keys and hurried from the office, Joseph felt a surge of what he could only call happiness. The case might be a sad one, but it felt so good to be back at work again. The traffic out of the town was sluggish, although Joseph knew that once he reached the roads that led to the marshes, the congestion would disappear. But right now, he was stationary, not something that his tight timetable had allowed for. As he tapped his fingers impatiently on the steering wheel and waited for his lane to start moving again, he caught sight of a group of men running along the curb. From their clothes, he thought they might be land workers, and they were trying to cross the busy road by dodging in and out of the slow-moving vehicles. Several of them were laughing and shouting in an Eastern European language. Suddenly, one of them ran around his car, then leaned across and slapped his palm loudly against the windscreen, then stared through it. Joseph automatically recoiled at seeing the man's eyes only inches away from his own. Then he almost leapt backwards in his seat, his heart hammering in his chest. He released his belt, swung around, and tried to see where the man had gone, but he was already on the far pavement and hurrying away. Joseph threw open the door of the car, stood up and stared after the retreating figure, but in seconds, the man had disappeared. A horn sounded loudly behind him, and he flopped back behind the wheel and put the car into gear. As he moved forward, he decided that he had to have been mistaken. Apparently everyone has a double, and he'd just had the misfortune to see one. As the lights changed and the road opened up again, he decided he had totally overreacted. The man had been running around with a pack of foreigners, ergo he was also a foreigner. So that settled it. How stupid could you get? He indicated off the main road and headed for the marshes. A long, straight drove road extended out ahead of him for as far as the eye could see. He put his foot down, and as the car surged forward, he felt as if he had taken back control of himself. He even managed a small laugh at his own stupidity. What on earth would a man who he had last seen in another continent 12 years ago be doing playing chicken in Greenborough High Road? It was unthinkable, and plain idiotic. He slowed the car as he approached a humpback bridge over a watery way, and tried to get his mind back to the late Martin Durham. The boss was convinced there was something not right about the manner of Durham's death,
And even though he had unearthed that cache of prescription drugs in Knott Cottage, Joseph was starting to believe that she might be right. When he finally arrived at the small converted bungalow that served as a surgery, Joseph had forgotten about his earlier case of mistaken identity, and his focus was fully back on the job in hand. If Dr. Helen Latimer had sounded brusque on the phone, her manner softened considerably when she met Joseph in person. "I'm so sorry, Sergeant. The news came as something of a shock. I'm afraid I may have sounded rather short. It wasn't intentional." She smiled at him apologetically. "Can I get you a coffee or a tea?" Joseph accepted the offer and looked around the consulting room as Latimer went to organize the drinks. It was like being in someone's sitting room. No modern medical equipment, nothing other than a desk, a computer, 2 chairs, and an examination couch. There were no nasty posters either, the ones that show reddish-brown muscles stretched over skeletons or eyeballs protruding from bony skulls. Dr. Latimer seemed to prefer watercolours of the Cornish coast and studies of black Labradors. On that basis alone, Joseph decided that he'd quite like her to be his GP. The doctor passed him a mug of coffee and sat down. He decided she must be in her late 30s, early 40s, but was a strikingly good-looking woman, with shoulder-length wavy chestnut hair and deep brown eyes. Her skin had a rich olive tint that made him think she may have some Mediterranean origins. He took his time and carefully explained everything they knew about the incident, and when he had finished, Helen Latimer shook her head emphatically and said, "No way. Absolutely no way in a million years. I know Martin, and yes, he did have medical problems, but his illness was managed and his drug regime well maintained." She held out her hands, palms up, and said, "I don't understand." "You seem to be the third woman involved in this that categorically refuses to believe Martin Durham was capable of doing what he did," said Joseph. "Who else are we talking about, Sergeant?" "My boss, D.I. Galena, and the WPC who was first on scene." Helen Latimer gave him a strange, enigmatic smile. "Nikki Galena is your boss?" "This is my first day as a permanent member of her team, Doctor, although I have worked with her before." He returned the smile, with what he hoped to be an equally cryptic quality. She nodded. "And as I remember, she and Martin were close, but she moved to the town, didn't she?" "The DI recently moved back to Cloud Fen." Joseph grew serious. "She spoke with Martin this morning. She said he was on really good form." "Then what in heaven's name happened?" mused the doctor. "We rather hoped that you may be able to help us there." Helen Latimer shook her head. "Sorry, but all I can do is release his medical records to you. The coroner's going to need them anyway." "Why did Martin need so many drugs?" "His immune system was damaged by illness and cancer treatment that he suffered in his early 20s. "What sort of cancer?" asked Joseph. "Cancer of the spleen." "Was there a chance that it had returned?" "Definitely not. They performed a splenectomy, and he had had yearly reassessments. I have always been kept well informed by the oncology clinic." She sat back and gave Joseph a rather sad smile. "Regarding his immune deficiency problems, I have only been his doctor for just over a year, so frankly I was maintaining an already carefully planned drug regime. It's actually quite ironic, but we had been discussing a complete review. New drugs are being developed all the time, and I was anxious that he have the most efficient medication for his needs." "And was he happy about that?" The doctor frowned. "Not initially, I have to admit. He seemed very reticent to alter anything, but last week he turned up for an appointment, all chirpy and bright, and said he'd like to go ahead." "And did you?" "Heavens, no. I needed to do a lot of research into his past history and prior medication before I'd even consider making changes, Sergeant." She gave Joseph a mildly reproachful look. "I would have needed to run all my suggestions past his consultant. This is complex and not a thing that I would undertake lightly. I hadn't even begun the process." "I see. And there was nothing else that you felt may be bothering him?" asked Joseph. She shook her head. "As your boss said, the last time I saw Martin Durham, he was in fine form. In fact, he seemed so well, I wondered if I should be even considering changing his medication." "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." "Exactly. But this time it was Martin who said we should explore new therapies. He was really enthusiastic. Considering his earlier reluctance, I was quite surprised."
I wonder what prompted the change of heart.
I guess we'll never know now, Sergeant, and I'm afraid you will have to excuse me. I have patients waiting, and I still need to organize those medical records for you. Joseph stood up and held out his hand.
I appreciate your time, Dr. Latimer.
You're welcome, and do ring me if you need anything else. She paused. Or if you discover anything that you think I should know about.
I will. Thank you.
Joseph turned to leave. Oh, and good luck working with D.I. Galena, Sergeant Easter. There was a slight chill to the words. As Joseph approached the reception desk, he wondered what the history was between Helen Latimer and his boss, because the undercurrent was practically pulling his feet from under him. Half an hour later, Joseph left, with a large sheaf of notes and a thick brown envelope under his arm. He was sure it would mean very little to him, but it would certainly be of great use to the pathologist. As he climbed into the driving seat and did up his safety belt, he was suddenly shocked by a vivid flashback to the face in the windscreen. Just for a second, it was there again. Rough, coarse-skinned, uneven teeth, ice-blue eyes and unwashed dull blonde hair. My God, it was so like him it was scary. Joseph shook his head free of the unwanted vision and jammed his key into the ignition. He didn't want to admit it, but he was obviously still a bit shaky. The hospital had said it would take time, so maybe he was not quite as fit as he had first thought. Or maybe it was just first-day nerves. A friend of your boss, turning up dead on your debut morning, was not exactly what you would choose. With a sigh, he drove away, with even more questions swirling around in his head than when he arrived. Chapter 6. As evening settled over the fen, lights came on in the scattered assortment of houses and cottages. Nikki looked from her upstairs window, across the shadowy marsh lanes and fields, and felt a deep sadness that Knott Cottage remained in darkness. She sat down heavily on her bed and wondered about the super's words. Maybe you really didn't know the people around you, even the ones you felt quite close to. She had known Martin for some 15 years and had never had an inkling about his illness. She let out a long, audible sigh. Everyone had secrets. There were certainly things about her that Martin would never have known. In fact, there were things about her that only a very small handful of people knew. And then there was Joseph. His past was a closed door, a locked room, bolted and secured as tightly as a Bank of England vault. She stood up and went downstairs. She needed a drink. The kitchen still had a faint smell of paint, not unpleasant, just fresh and clean. She had been surprised how well the old place had scrubbed up, and even although today's dreadful events had placed a heavy blanket of melancholy over everything, she was still glad to be back home on Cloud Fen, and she was glad that Joseph had decided to join the team. She splashed wine into a glass, sipped it slowly, then placing the glass on the old scrubbed pine table, the one she had sat at to eat her eggy soldiers as a small girl, she thought about Joseph. Maybe she should have spared him the grim task of suicide statistics on his first day. He had seemed really subdued when he returned from his trip to see Helen Latimer. Nikki gave a little snort, but then who wouldn't? Dear Helen could be a caustic cow sometimes. She took another sip of the Merlot and tried to decide what to eat. Food was never high on her list of priorities, and it was 10 to 1 that it would be yet another omelette. Unlike Martin, he had always prepared and cooked delicious meals for himself. She saw again the pot simmering on the old stove. She had looked in it and noted the fresh vegetables and thick meaty stock. Martin took great care of his diet, something she rarely seemed to find time for. Taking eggs from a chicken-shaped pottery container, she broke 3 into a glass bowl, added salt, pepper, a few herbs and a splash of milk, then whisked it together thoughtfully. Helen Latimer might be a bitch, but she would surely have been as charmed as every other woman in the county by Joseph Easter's sexy good looks. Surely even Helen wouldn't have upset him on the first meeting. So why did he seem so distracted, so troubled? She should have asked him, but he seemed keen to get away, and she couldn't blame him. It had been a pretty depressing day, all in all. Nikki removed a fork from the cutlery drawer, then served up her meagre supper on one of her mother's best plates. There was something enormously reassuring about having familiar old things about her again. Her rented flat in Greenborough had been basic, minimalist, Spartan. She smiled to herself. Who was she kidding? Depressingly austere was closer to the truth. Still smiling ruefully, she switched on the radio and tuned it in to Radio 4 Extra. She badly needed something to lift her spirits, and a hammy old wireless show might do the trick. She ate the eggs and half-heartedly began to listen to a classic episode of Hancock, but after a while she switched it off. It seemed somehow disrespectful, knowing what had happened earlier that day, and as she washed up, she found herself hoping that Joseph had not returned to work too soon. The tinkling sound of a wind chime from the floor above distracted her from her worrying thoughts. She glanced at the clock. The tide had turned and was bringing in a strong blow off the sea. She had better go up and latch the windows, just in case there was a summer squall. In her bedroom, she paused to once again look in the direction of Martin's place, and found herself rooted to the spot. A tiny point of light was moving around inside Knock Cottage. Nikki blinked a few times and refocused her eyes. There was no doubt someone was in Martin's cottage, and whoever it was had no sodding right to be there. With a muffled curse, Nikki raced down the stairs, grabbed a flashlight and her mobile phone, and raced from the farmhouse. There was no way she could take the car. Whoever was there would hear her coming and leg it. She had no choice but to go on foot, and she covered the 1/4 of a mile in record time. At the gate, she sunk down for a moment into the deep shadows and caught her breath. Keeping perfectly still, she watched the darkened cottage carefully. Whoever was in there might not be alone. Her ears strained to make out sounds, but there was little other than the whisper of the wind across the marsh and the eerie call of a night owl. With great care, she crept towards the side of the cottage and made her way round to the back door. It was open just a crack, no doubt to facilitate a speedy exit if required. Rustling sounds were coming from inside, as if someone were leafing swiftly through a newspaper, trying to find a particular article. Nikki stood behind the door and tried to see exactly where the intruder was. He was still in the sitting room, so whatever he was looking for was obviously proving more difficult to find than he had expected. She stared in, but could only make out a black shape behind the fine light point of the torch, and he was hunched over Martin's dining table. Nikki tried to think. It seemed to her that she had two choices: rush in and challenge him, or keep low and follow him when he came out. Sadly, although following him could mean catching whoever it was red-handed, it could also mean she could lose him completely, especially if he had a vehicle concealed nearby. Which left little choice. Nikki swung a hefty kick at the door, reached inside, and with a loud shout, flicked on the light switch. It had been a pretty good idea, and it would have worked, if the intruder had not tripped the fuses on the electric meter when he broke in. By the time she realized what had happened and switched on her flashlight, the man was upon her. Nikki fought back. She had never backed off from a fight and rarely came off second best in a tussle, but circumstances were not in her favor. Her assailant caught her a crushing blow in the ribs, one that totally winded her, and by the time she had regained her breath, he was gone. She staggered out after him, but heard the sound of a powerful motorcycle engine roar into the night, and realized that there would be no chasing him. Cursing and swearing her way to the meter, Nikki flipped up the switches and squinted as the light came on. "Shit, shit!" she shouted out loud. The sitting room was wrecked. Martin's precious belongings lay broken and shattered in untidy piles across the carpet. She looked around in both dismay and anger, and found herself fighting back tears. "I just hope you never found whatever it was you were after, you bastard scumbag!" She tried to wipe the salty water from her cheeks with the sleeve of her blouse. "Bastard!" Still cursing, Nikki pulled her mobile from her pocket, breathed a sigh of relief that it was still working, and quickly punched the speed dial number for the police station. Chapter 7. The main car park of the Greenborough Fitness Club and pool was deserted. Joseph parked close to the door and pulled his gym bag from the seat beside him. He had taken to getting there just before 6:30 when the club opened. He liked the calm of the place in the early morning, and plunging into an empty pool had a decadence that he secretly enjoyed. He'd always tried to find time for a swim, mainly early like this to prep him for the day ahead, but sometimes he'd go in the evening to wash away the stresses of a grueling shift. Greenborough Club had quite limited facilities, but as he was somewhat limited himself, that suited him perfectly. He cruised steadily up and down in the warm water and tried to forget that he'd had a sincerely crap night. His sleep had been interrupted by disturbing dreams that had left him feeling uneasy and edgy. Martin Durham's peculiar death had not helped, and neither had that weird incident with the man in the high road. He switched from breaststroke to crawl and tried to concentrate entirely on his breathing. It didn't work, so he flipped over, stared at the ceiling to keep in lane, and propelled himself backwards for a few lengths. Part of him wanted to see that jaywalker again, to see him properly, note the differences, then laugh at himself for being such a prat. And another part of him was loath to meet the doppelganger of such a brute of a man. Joseph turned in the water and ducked under. The rushing in his ears whisked away the unwanted thoughts, and holding his breath, he swam underwater until he touched the wall. He had another 15 minutes before he had to hit the shower room. He hauled himself out of the pool, rinsed himself off under one of the poolside showers, and walked along the wet tiled floor to the steam room. A thick, steamy cloud made it impossible to see if he were alone in the small room, but a movement on the top seating ledge told him he wasn't. "Mind if I join you?" he asked his unseen companion. "Be my guest. I'm practically expiring. I'm sure they rent this out at night to a lobster boiling company." A tall figure leaned forward, then slipped down to the lower ledge. A tiny shiver rippled through him as her leg lightly brushed his shoulder as she climbed down. "I swear they've turned the temperature up this morning." Noting it was the woman from the car park, Joseph silently agreed that it was becoming extremely hot indeed in the tiny enclosed space. "Bryony." The woman held out a well-manicured hand. "I've seen you here before." He took her hand and was surprised by the firmness of her grip. "Joseph, pleased to meet you." The woman stood up. "Sorry, Joseph. I hate to be rude, but I've got a busy morning lined up. See you again, no doubt." Joseph flashed her his brightest smile. "I hope so." After the glass door had closed, he let out a long, low whistle. He really would need a cold shower today, and the steam had nothing to do with it. "Well, you look a damn sight happier than you did when you left last night," murmured Nikki as he entered her office. Joseph raised his eyebrows. "And you look like you've had a run-in with the riot squad." He stared at the purple shadow that was staining one cheekbone, and did not miss the fact she was protecting her ribcage. "What happened, Mom?" She stood up and winced. "Come with me to the super's office. He wants the gruesome details too, and I don't know if I have the energy to say it all twice." He walked beside her along the corridor to the lifts. "Some bastard broke into Martin's cottage last night." Her voice was low and full of contempt. "You're joking." "Do I look like I'm joking, Sergeant?" She growled. "Sorry, it was only an expression of incredulity. I wasn't questioning you." He shook his head in disbelief. "Are you okay?" "I'll live." She pressed the button for the lift, "but I cannot tell you how much I'd like to meet that intruder again. Preferably in the custody suite. I'm not too worried where it is, Sergeant. I just want the opportunity to even the score." Joseph couldn't ignore the dark shade of the old Nikki Galena in those words, but chose to hold his tongue. The lift sighed to a halt, and they made their way to Rick Bainbridge's office, where Nikki filled them in on what had occurred. "Sounds like an opportunist to me," speculated the super. "Bad news travels fast. Maybe someone got to hear of Durham's death, knew the place would be empty and ransacked it." "Sorry, sir, but whoever that was looking for something specific." "And what the devil would that be?" "Initially a key, sir." Nikki bit the inside of her cheek. "Joseph and I looked for it earlier, only we replaced the vases and the ornaments that we searched. We didn't smash them to pieces." "The key to what?" asked the super. "Martin's desk. It was locked when we were there." Her expression hardened. "It's matchwood now." The super's brow knitted into a wrinkled frown. "But what was he looking for?" Nikki shrugged. "I've no idea." "Whatever it was very important to him," added Joseph. "After all, you called out that you were the police, and he still thought it was worth knocking 7 bales out of you." "Thank you for reminding me of that, Sergeant," said Nikki, nursing her side. "And another thing, it wasn't a lucky wallop either. The intruder knew exactly where to hit me to incapacitate me." "So what are you saying, Nikki? That Durham was involved in something dodgy?" "I don't know what the hell I'm saying." Her face was a mask of confusion. "I just know that kind and generous man, someone I thought I knew, has committed a terrible act, and I have the horrible feeling that nothing is quite as it seems at Knott Cottage." The super allowed her outburst to abate, then said, "Have you had your injuries checked out?" She nodded. "The FMO was treating a prisoner when I came here last night. It's only bruising. It'll pass." "So, where do you want to go from here?" Joseph threw her a warning glance. She needed to cool down, or the super would give the case to another team. He saw her close her eyes for a moment, and he knew that she had understood his meaning. "We'll just continue gathering evidence for the inquest, sir." Her voice was calmer, "and as soon as the sergeant and I have spoken to Martin Durham's sister, we'll make a careful search of Knott Cottage." She took a deep breath. "I know that I disturbed him, and I'm still not entirely sure that he found what he was looking for." The super nodded. "Then you'd better get a man out there to keep an eye on the place, and we should watch your home too, but finances probably won't stretch." "There's been an officer at Martin's since last night, and I can take care of myself, thank you, sir," said Nikki. Then she gave him a half grin. "It may have been pitch black, but the intruder didn't get away scot-free. In the scuffle, I managed to grab a few strands of his hair. It's gone to the lab for DNA testing." Joseph smiled broadly. "Good on you, Mom. If he's on the database, we've got him. And if he isn't, if we get a suspect, we can place him at the scene of the crime. Good work." The super stood up and pulled a face. "Now, I've got an appointment with the auditor from hell, so if that's all—" "Right, sir. We'll get out to Old Bolingbroke." "Just remember to report in later, Inspector." "Wilco, sir." "I'll drive, Mom," said Joseph tactfully. "Help me to get a feel for the area." Nikki agreed, knowing full well that he was thinking only of her, which was great because her side was killing her. "We take the main road north out of Greenborough and pick up the A16. I'll direct you in as we get closer." Joseph pulled out of the station yard and slipped easily into the light traffic flow. "So, you know Elizabeth Durham?" "Not well. I've met her a few times. She came over as being a very genuine, friendly person. She and Martin were close. He told me they were inseparable during their college days." Joseph slowed down at a pedestrian crossing and waved a small group of children across. "Students together? What did they study?" "I'm not sure, really, although Elizabeth is some sort of tree person," said Nikki, trying to remember the full title of her chosen profession. "Well respected, apparently." "I guess you're not talking about a lumberjack or a tree hugger." Nikki smiled. "I'm not sure about her personal habits, but she is, let me get this right, an arboriculturist. Martin called her a landscape architect." "Funny that. There aren't too many trees here on the Fens." "There are where we're going. It may only be a 20-minute drive, but you'll notice a big difference in the countryside. It's less agricultural closer to the wolds. Lots more trees." "And you say she lives with her partner. What does he do?" Her partner is Jana Hepburn Lowe." Joseph threw her a swift glance, then returned his eyes to the road. "From the Hepburn Lowe family?" "Yep, they've been together for years." Nikki groaned and tried to ease herself into a more comfortable position. "Do try to avoid bloody manhole covers, Joseph. My ribs feel like they've been kicked by a horse." "Sorry. Go on." "Jana's another nature lover. She owns a massive garden centre quite close to where they live." She tilted her head to one side. "And it wasn't Daddy's millions that provided it either. Jana actually worked there as a kid, Saturday job or something. Loved it so much she finished up buying it when the original owners retired." "Good for her," said Joseph. Then his face clouded over. "But I guess that rules out financial worries on Martin's part. If he was in debt and his sister loved him, she'd hardly let him get suicidal over money troubles. Not when your partner is loaded." "Exactly." She pointed to a large sign. "Get in the right-hand lane, right at the roundabout, and you're on the road to the A16, okay?" "Roger, Mom." Nikki shifted again, trying to keep the seatbelt away from her bruised side. "You know, I have a really bad feeling about all this, Joseph, and it has nothing to do with knowing Martin." She stared out of the car window. "That man who trashed Knott Cottage. He was a pro, I'm sure of it." "Then it's good that we have uniform watching the place until we get there. It shouldn't be too difficult to spot your man's modus operandi for his search, even if he tried to make it look like the super's opportunist burglar." "Did he get what he was after, I wonder?" sighed Nikki. "And what could be that important?" countered Joseph. Nikki sat back and felt a steely determination creep over her. "I don't know yet, Joseph.
but I'm damn sure that I won't rest until I find out what the hell's going on."
Joseph nodded emphatically. "I don't doubt you for 1 minute, Ma'am, and for what it's worth, I'm with you all the way." Elizabeth Durham opened the door to them herself, and although it was a very long time since they'd last met, Nikki recognized her immediately. On the surface, the woman covered her grief well, but the dark-rimmed eyes, the slight tremors of the hands, and the occasional lapses in concentration gave her sorrow away as clearly as if she were wearing widow's weeds. She invited them into the lounge, a large, airy, high-ceilinged room that opened into a splendid, well-stocked garden room. "I still can't believe it," she said after the introductions had been made, "and I don't understand."
"No one does," said Nikki simply. "We're all at a loss to know what could have caused him to do such a thing. And Elizabeth, I am so very sorry. Martin was such a good friend and neighbour." She wordlessly shrugged her acceptance of the condolences, then suddenly looked exhausted and lowered herself down onto the deep cushions of the sofa. With a flourish of one hand, she indicated for them to do the same, and she watched them as they chose 2 chairs opposite her. "Can I get you some refreshments?" Nikki and Joseph both declined. It seemed almost too much to ask, as if that one small act of boiling a kettle might cause the floodgates to break.
"When will I be able to have him back? To organise his funeral?"
Nikki swallowed. "I'm afraid that depends on the coroner, Elizabeth. The inquest opens the day after tomorrow, but it will be adjourned, awaiting all the reports." She gave her an apologetic smile. "It's a complicated case, with both witness statements and a lot of forensic reports. It will take time to prepare, and there will be a lot for him to consider."
"So it may be held up for some time."
Nikki chose her words carefully. "Maybe, or he may allow you to bury him."
"But my brother wanted to be cremated."
"Oh, it will be a cremation, definitely." This was not going well. Elizabeth was a highly intelligent woman, but shock had blurred her normally sharp mind.
"The thing is,"
Joseph's soft voice had taken over.
"The thing is, Miss Durham, that we are all very worried about Martin's sudden decision to end his life. We need to explore every avenue to understand what happened, and until we are satisfied with our findings and a satisfactory explanation has been reached, we cannot allow Martin's body to be cremated." He paused. "For your sake, and for your brother, we need to provide you with answers."
"The coroner may feel that you need some sort of closure," added Nikki gently, "so he could grant you permission for a burial, then later, when a verdict has been reached, Martin's wishes could be followed." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears.
"Dig him up?"
"I know it sounds awful, but it's done very discreetly, with the utmost care and compassion," added Joseph, "and please, don't concern yourself. It may never come to that." "Where is Jana?" asked Nikki, concerned that Elizabeth was alone. A small smile spread across her face. "She slipped over to the garden centre while you were here with me. She needs to tie up a few things with her manager. She's taking some time off so that I don't have to deal with this alone." "That's good."
"She's a good person," said Elizabeth, "and she's worried sick over me."
"Would it be too soon to ask a few questions?" Nikki did not want to cause any more distress, but she still needed to tell Elizabeth about the break-in at Knott Cottage.
"Oh, I'll do all I can to help." She visibly rallied. "And I'm sorry about just now. I don't know what came over me."
She looked at them in turn, then abruptly stood up.
"First some coffee. Why don't you both go down to the garden room? There's a lovely view over the gardens, and you can just see Jana's pride and joy in the distance. I'll fetch the drinks, and then I'll do my best to answer your questions."
Nikki followed Joseph down 3 shallow steps and into the big conservatory. The scent of jasmine and some other sweet oriental flower hit her immediately.
"This is beautiful," she whispered.
"This is expensive," returned Joseph. "Very, very expensive." He pointed to a panel on the wall. "State-of-the-art automated blinds, automatic humidity and temperature control. Very nice indeed." And the exterior of the property was like manicured parkland. "How the other half live?" she breathed,
And I guess that is the fabled garden centre. At the bottom of the rolling lawns and on the far side of a long pasture, sunlight was glinting off a massive glass structure. This lodge was the gatehouse for the original estate. Elizabeth stood at the top of the steps. We added the garden room, plants being a passion for us both, and we've drawn up plans to build a Victorian-style orangery. That would be some project to undertake, said Joseph. If we ever find the time, but excuse me, the coffee will be ready. Nikki glanced impatiently at her watch. She wanted to talk to Elizabeth, but she needed to get back to the cottage to try to find out what had been stolen. Black or white? Elizabeth placed a tray on a decorated rattan table, picked up the cafetiere, and poured the coffee. Nikki decided that there was no time left for procrastination. She took her drink, sat in a big cane chair by the window, and said, "When did you last see your brother?" "About a week ago. He came for supper a couple of times a month." "And how did he seem?" "Top form." She sipped her drink tentatively. "That's what makes it all so hard to understand. We both commented on how happy he seemed." "More than usual?" "Maybe. Or perhaps he was just pleased because a paper he'd written was coming up for publication shortly." "Oh, really? On what subject?" asked Joseph with interest. "Salt marsh ecology, management and restoration." She gave them a weak smile. "Sounds pretty heavy, doesn't it? When Martin was younger, he wanted to be a forensic botanist, but his illness put paid to that. When he recovered, he did continue to study biology and botany, and the marshes provided him with constant interest." "I knew that he was pretty interested in the local plant life, but I had no idea that he was that knowledgeable." Nikki was starting to wonder if she actually knew anything about Martin Durham. "Did he have any money worries?" "My brother was not rich, but he was financially secure, and the cottage was his, no mortgage. He had no debts either, so no, that was not the problem." "And there is nothing that you can think of that may have been bothering him?" "I've gone over and over this since the moment I heard he was dead, but there's nothing, absolutely nothing." "Did he mention anything to you about changing his medication?" asked Joseph abruptly. Elizabeth's hand trembled for a moment, then her jaw clenched. "What do you mean?" Nikki stared at her. Why should that question bother her? Joseph gave her an innocent look. "Sorry, but we understand that he was keen for his GP to revise his regime." "Oh, that. Yes, I believe she had suggested new drugs were available. I'm not sure if he decided to go ahead, though." "And I hate to ask this," added Joseph, "but did he ever take any recreational drugs?" Elizabeth Durham suddenly laughed out loud. "Martin, that's a joke. He was phobic about his medication. He took nothing that could upset the balance, not even a herbal remedy. Ask anyone at the Wild Goose. He'd gone there for years, and I guarantee you, he never took one sip of alcohol in all that time, so drugs. No, Sergeant, he wouldn't have dared." "I'm sorry, but I had to ask," said Joseph quietly, "because he was not acting rationally when he went to St. Saviour's Church." "I should say not. He killed himself, didn't he?" said Elizabeth icily. "There is another problem, Elizabeth," interjected Nikki. "Knott Cottage was broken into last night. I accosted the intruder, but sadly he got the better of me." She indicated to her bruised face. "Oh!" Elizabeth's hands flew up to her mouth. "How could they? Some thugs, I suppose, looking for money for drugs. It's always that these days, isn't it? Oh, poor Martin. He was so particular about his home." "Please, don't worry about me," thought Nikki, but said, "I believe the intruder was after something in particular. Would you have any idea what that could be?" Elizabeth's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, he had nothing of great value." "What about his papers? Maybe the one about the salt marsh. Would it have any monetary significance?" She shook her head. "No, years of work, yes, but it's not about making money." Nikki felt a mild sense of discomfort surrounding Martin's sister, but pressed on. So there would have been nothing of importance inside his locked desk then? "Nothing that I know of," replied Elizabeth shortly. "Well, thank you for your help." Nikki stood up. "I'm sorry if we distressed you." Will you keep me notified of any developments?
Nikki nodded. Of course, and we may need to speak to you again. Right now, we're going back to Knott Cottage.
You know, Martin thought a lot of you and Hannah,
Elizabeth said suddenly.
He was very upset when Robert left you, although he never liked the man, I'm afraid.
No one in their right mind liked my ex-husband, Elizabeth, said Nikki with a grimace. The only good thing about him was his daughter.
And how is Hannah now?
No change, although they are talking about sending her to a clinic in Belgium and Liège. Nikki didn't want to talk about Hannah and stepped a little closer to the door. They offer no promises, but they understand her problem better than most. Elizabeth seemed to sense her discomfort, nodded sadly, and changed the subject.
When do you think I'll be able to go over and clean up? I'd like to go soon. Martin would hate it to be in a mess.
Nikki understood what she meant. His place was always immaculate. Too immaculate, she wondered. We'll ring you. She took a card from her bag and handed it to Elizabeth. My mobile number and direct line is on that. If you think of anything, no matter how insignificant, contact me, okay? Joseph drove carefully through the gate, making sure to avoid a large uneven manhole and onto the main road.
What was that all about?
Pass. She was fine, although naturally distraught about her brother, until you mentioned the drugs, then she nearly disappeared up her own bottom. But why? Not sure, but I got the distinct impression that she knew exactly what was in that locked desk. Which is more than we bloody do, muttered Nikki, and I've been wondering about his obsession for cleanliness. He's always been that way, and I never really thought much about it. Now I'm wondering if he was scared of infections, what with having to take all those tablets to keep healthy. Probably was. Joseph nodded. I'm sure I would be. Nikki clutched at her waist as they approached a level crossing. Shit, that's tender. Then I suggest we find somewhere to grab a hot drink, a sandwich, and you take some very strong painkillers before we go on to Knott Cottage. I agree, and I know where we can get all that for free. She grimaced through the pain. My kitchen. Chapter 8. Knott Cottage had thrown up nothing of interest. The only papers left in a small stationery drawer in the broken desk were some diet sheets and lists of vitamin and mineral supplements. Only one thing had claimed Nikki's attention, and that was an old photograph. One of Martin, Hannah, and herself collecting samphire out of the marsh. Wind rippled their hair into ringlets and tugged at their clothes. She remembered the day, and the buckets of the fleshy-leaved plant that her aunt wanted for pickling, but she couldn't for the life of her recall who had taken the picture. It had made her feel both nostalgic and mildly confused as to why Martin had kept it. Now the photo sat on her desk. She rather liked it, and it would mean nothing to anyone else, so, for now at least, it would stay with her. Joseph was sorting the paperwork they had brought back, and she was rereading the witness statements when the phone rang. Mr. Cavendish Small, what can I do for you? The man sounded on edge, which Nikki thought to be quite understandable, considering what he'd been through.
I just keep feeling that it was all my fault, Inspector, but I was terrified that my sightseers may rush for the stairs, you see, and that would have been a terrible disaster, and there were children to consider.
How could it possibly have been your fault?
Because I reached out to him, and he recoiled as if I were the devil incarnate.
The man paused, then said,
One of the kiddies said the man was afraid of me, and I believe the boy was right. But what could I have done to scare him so badly that he—
Listen to me, Mr. Cavendish Small. It was absolutely nothing to do with you. We don't know what upset the balance of his mind, but I assure you, it happened to him long before he ever got near that viewing platform.
Common sense says that you were right, Inspector Galena, but you didn't see his eyes. I'll never forget them. They looked like the sort of thing you see in horror films, not in your own parish church.
Nikki felt desperately sorry, but could not console him. How could she? It must have been quite horrific. All I can say is that it wasn't your fault, sir. That poor man was just very sick, beyond anyone's help. The most important thing is that no one else was hurt, and that was down to you. You did very well under dreadful circumstances, sir. The man's voice seemed to lack all power, and he said,
Thank you, Inspector. It's kind of you to say that, but I still believe I may have been to blame.
Before Nikki could reply, she realized that Charles Cavendish Small had hung up. She replaced her phone, stared at the old photograph propped up against her monitor screen, and thought, Oh, Martin,
What have you done?" Joseph was having trouble concentrating. For some reason, every time he found himself with a few moments to himself, his mind wandered to the woman from the pool. Bryony, she had called herself. He didn't think he'd ever met anyone with that name before. He wondered what she did for a living, and he also wondered if she were married, because that would be where his fantasy ended. He didn't do married. In fact, it had been years since he did anything that involved a relationship of any kind. He had one failed marriage of his own and one difficult daughter living in another country, and it still hurt, so... He picked up his mobile phone from the desk and went to find the boss. He needed some work to keep his mind from straying. In the corridor, he was practically leapt on by Kat Cullen and Dave Harris. He knew from their beaming faces that they had just had a really good result. "Wacky Backy Farm all sorted?" he asked.
"Not just one, 3 of them, Sarge."
Kat's eyes sparkled. "And we got all but one of the little scroats who were running them," added Dave.
"Drinks are on us tonight, Sarge, over in the Hammer at 7. Can you make it?"
"I'll be there, and good work. The governor will be well pleased." "We'll just need to get the paperwork done, and we're free to help you out, Sarge." Dave gave him a shrewd look. "I hear not everything in the garden is blooming."
"And that the gov took a beating?"
added Kat in a little more than a whisper. Joseph nodded. "There's a bad feeling about this inquiry, all right. Even I'm unsettled by it, and I never knew the poor guy who topped himself."
"Well, as from tomorrow, we are all yours. Maybe 4 heads will be better than 2.
Kat skipped off like a little kid going to a party.
"Don't forget, 7 o'clock at the Hammer."
"Is the governor okay, Sarge?" Dave had real concern in his voice. "Very sore in more ways than one. The bruises she can handle, but she's far from happy that the assailant decked her." Dave smiled. "Ah, yes, that would smart, but as long as she's not badly hurt." He moved off down the corridor. "See you later, Sarge." The DI wasn't in her office, and Joseph really didn't feel like going back to the suspicious death reports, so he headed for the vending machine outside the mess room. The governor's sandwich had worked at the time, but he felt a strong desire for a chocolate boost. As he strolled along the window-lined corridor, he thought about her home on the fen. It was the kind of house he would have loved to have brought up lots of kids in, and at least 3 dogs and a cat. She'd always referred to it as a cottage, but it was a proper family farmhouse, and it seemed all wrong for her to live there alone. He pushed some coins into the machine, pressed a button, and waited. At least it would be a better bet than the slum of a town flat she'd rented, in order to be closer to the drug dealers. Cloud Cottage Farm was a lovely old place, and he sincerely hoped she'd be happy back there. If he were honest, he'd never really felt comfortable on the wide-open flatlands, but seeing Cloud Fen today, he had to admit that there was an airy kind of magic to it, and it was slowly winning him over. He picked up his Snickers, peeled off the wrapper and balled it up. The bin was a little further along the corridor, and he aimed, threw, and missed. With a snort of disgust, he picked it up and placed it inside, glancing out of the big picture window as he did. There was not much to see, just a narrow lane that ran along the side of the station and down towards the river. It was fairly regularly used, but right now there was only a dog walker and a couple of old men deep in conversation. He bit into the chocolate and thought about Bryony. Maybe he should ask her to go for a drink with him. It couldn't hurt, and if she said no, well, at least he'd tried. Joseph sighed and watched as the dog walker disappeared and a woman with a shopping trolley took his place. With something of a shock, he suddenly realized that he didn't want Bryony to say no. Since his last case, his priorities had changed. He thought of Nikki Galena, all alone in that big house, and he knew that he didn't want to be like that. He wanted someone to share his life with. He didn't want to just exist and work. He wanted to live. He straightened up and smiled to himself. He'd go to the pool tomorrow, and he'd sound her out. Then, if she happened to be unattached, well, just a drink. No one could take offense at that now, could they? The thought had barely had time to compute through his brain, when everything froze. He was no longer aware of anything going on around him. He heard nothing and saw nothing, other than the man who was standing down in the lane staring up at him, his right hand touching his forehead in a smart salute. Joseph almost gagged on the chocolate. It was him. Not a double, not a figment of his imagination. It was Billy Sweet. "Joseph, you okay?" Nikki stood just meters away from him, but he didn't seem to notice her. For a moment she thought he was ill. Then she saw his expression. She tried to read what she saw, but it was difficult. Confusion, disbelief, and what looked like fear all clouded his handsome face. I thought... He turned to the window and stared anxiously out. "What, Joseph? What's wrong?" "There was a man in the, lane." His speech was stilted. "Someone I knew once." Nikki raised her eyebrows. "And presumably someone you didn't like very much." Joseph's expression hardened. "I hated him." He suddenly leant back against the wall and shook his head. "That's a word I never wanted to hear myself say again. I thought I'd learned all about forgiveness, but then I never thought I'd see him again." "Who is he?" asked Nikki. "A bad man," answered Joseph slowly. "A very bad man." Nikki walked over to the window and looked down into the empty lane. "And you are sure it was him?" "It was him." "Where was he?" "Directly below us, staring up here at me." His face screwed up. "But how would he know I was here?" Nikki frowned. "With all this glass, if he kept watch on the station for a while, he'd spot you sooner or later. Let's check out the CCTV. What's his name, by the way?" For a moment, Nikki thought that Joseph was not going to be able to speak. He was certainly having trouble naming the devil. "Billy Sweet," he murmured. "But don't be fooled by the name. He's pure evil." "Come on, let's go to the control room, see if we can find him." Nikki led the way, and having told the civilian in charge what area they wanted to trace, sat down in front of the computer screens and waited. "Two old gits having a barney, some old biddy with a shopper. Now where is our man?" She stared at the monitors. "Ah, there, is that? No, it's a bloke and a dog." "Where did you say he stood?" asked the CCTV operator. Nikki looked at Joseph, who explained again. "Then he must have got into the blind spot, Sergeant. There's one area where the cameras aren't aligned properly. I've been asking maintenance to sort it for weeks." "But surely we'd see him walking into the lane?" asked Nikki. "Not if he came up our glass alley. It converges into the area with no coverage." "Fat lot of bloody good that is," growled Nikki. "These are really sodding useless. When you need one, they're either vandalised or there's no one available to watch them." She turned to Joseph. "Sorry, Sergeant, but your man got lucky." Joseph exhaled. "Maybe, or—" Nikki observed him carefully. Whatever this sweet character had done in the past, it was having one hell of an impact right now, and she didn't like it. She had never seen him so rattled, and the last thing Joseph needed was some creepy blast from the past ruining the life he was just getting back together. She stood up and walked to the door. "Coffee? In my office? We need to talk." In the short time that Nikki had known Joseph Easter, he had demonstrated incredible self-control. Being an impatient person herself, there had been times when his laid-back approach had made her want to tear his head off his shoulders. And he never talked about himself. The tiny pieces of his life that she was acquainted with had not been shared without considerable pain. The one thing she did know was that he had once been a soldier, a Special Forces operative, and she had the distinct idea that Billy Sweet came from that area of his past. She stirred her coffee thoughtfully and contemplated the word eggshells. "Right, before you tell me to put out, my friend, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. What I say may not be my true opinion, but hear me out." Joseph looked at her over the top of his coffee mug and nodded silently. "Clearly, you haven't seen this person for years. Could you possibly be mistaken?" "He looked exactly the same as I remember him, and his face is etched on my memory for reasons that I'd prefer not to discuss, Mom," said Joseph stonily. "Well, that's odd for starters. He should have aged." "Maybe he had. I didn't see him for more than a second or two." Nikki decided not to press the point, that if he'd only seen him fleetingly, he could well have been wrong. "Moving on, is it probable that this man should turn up in Greenborough?" "No. Highly improbable." Joseph ran a hand through his hair and shook his head slowly. "I thought about that the last time I saw him, and—" "You've seen him before?" she exclaimed. "You never said." "It was when I was driving out to see Dr. Latimer." "I knew you were troubled by something when you came back. I thought Helen had upset you." Joseph told her about his encounter, then sat back and shrugged. "I'd convinced myself that it was just some guy that reminded me of Billy Sweet. But now
I'm sure it was him, Mom. Dead certain.
Does he have some sort of unfinished business with you, Joseph? Joseph's eyes narrowed.
I don't know. Maybe he knew that I suspected him of some terrible things. Maybe not. The other men he served with didn't want him near them either. He was fearless, but he was a psycho, Mom, and a loose cannon like that could cost you your life, or that of your comrades. But no. The last I heard, he had shipped out and joined a private security force. By that time, I was in Civvy Street. End of story. Or so I thought.
You once told me you had a bad mission. Was he part of it?
Joseph closed his eyes. I can't go there right now, Mom.
Nikki knew the answer.
Okay, so what do we do next?
I don't know.
He scratched his head.
Why on earth would he be here?
I suggest we ask him.
His eyes widened. And how are we going to do that? He's like a will-o'-the-wisp, here one moment and gone the next.
Well, did you notice his clothes?
Joseph thought for a minute. Dark zipper jacket, thin nylon material, black jeans, and a t-shirt, pale, dirty white or grey, maybe. Shoes were some kind of suede trainers. Really grubby.
Nikki nodded.
Good. Excellent, in fact. Let's go back to the control room and get them to track him. Hopefully there's more than one camera in this town that is actually working, so they should have a good chance of spotting him. Especially if he decided to play chicken in the middle of Greenborough High Road yesterday, don't you think?
Good point, Mom, and I appreciate your concern, but this is hardly a police matter. We've got a lot of work to do on Martin's case.
Naturally, the investigation comes first, but I don't want some creepy shit freaking out my detectives. So we deal with him, then we get on with our own work, okay?
Joseph stood up, looking slightly less harassed.
Let's do it.
What do you mean, inconclusive?
Nikki felt her temperature begin to rise.
Sorry, ma'am. We found the incident that Sergeant Easter described, but the footage is too grainy to identify anyone specific. It's certainly not clear enough to lift an image. Oh, great. Okay, let me have a tape of it anyway. Thanks for trying.
The woman left, and Nikki sank down in her chair. If they had managed to get a mugshot of the man, she could circulate it and get him brought in. Joseph could then have looked at him close up, and that would have been that. Either a simple case of mistaken identity, or Joseph would have to take an unwanted trip down memory lane. She gnawed on the inside of her cheek. Just say Joseph was correct, and this Billy Sweet really was rampaging down a Lincolnshire high street. What the hell did he want? It had to be something to do with Joseph. She wanted what Billy Sweet had done. If the whole unit despised him, it had to be something pretty grim.
Mom, you wanted me?
Kat Cullen leant around the door. Her recently emerald-green striped hairstyle was now reduced to just white blonde spikes. Nikki grinned at her.
Very good work with the cannabis farms, Detective. An excellent result. Targav, Dave and me are pretty chuffed with ourselves. You have every right to be.
Nikki jabbed her thumb in the direction of a chair.
I want you to do me a little favour before we discuss your next investigation. You've spent a lot of time on the streets recently. Would this man mean anything to you?
She handed Kat Joseph's written description of Billy Sweet.
Phew, that could be half the guys that I've been hanging out with, but it really doesn't sound like anyone I could name. Want me to make inquiries, Gov?
Nikki nodded, then looked up as the CCTV operator appeared in the doorway and handed her a CD.
Stick this in the machine, Kat. It may help, although I'm told the quality is crap.
Kat took the CD and switched on the viewer. After a few moments, they were watching 3 lanes of painfully slow-moving traffic.
This will never make the Cannes Film Festival, Mum. When does the action start? About now, I should think. There's Joseph's Ford, at a standstill in the middle lane. And what are those yobs doing? They are the ones that we are interested in. Watch Joseph's vehicle. One of those men apparently hammered on his windscreen, then ran away. Wow, said Kat. If that's their idea of fun, they really need to get out more.
As Joseph had described, the group of men ran in and out of the traffic, dodging and weaving as the vehicles moved forward or stopped. Then one of them broke away and dived in front of Joseph's Ford.
The quality is crap, you're right.
Kat leaned in closer.
What's he doing? Looks like he's slapping the windscreen. Now he's leaning over the bonnet and staring inside. What an arsehole!
Kat frowned.
And now he's off.
Nikki stared at the screen. No question, the man was unidentifiable. But now she looked at Joseph. He had jumped out of his car and was staring around anxiously, trying to see where the man had gone. "The Sarge overreacted a bit, didn't he, Gov?" asked Kat. "It was only some prat doing what prats do." Nikki didn't answer. She'd been thinking exactly the same thing, and whether the man was Billy Sweet or Lord Lucan, Joseph clearly believed he had seen a ghost. "Go out for the afternoon, Kat. Ask around. See if this description rings any bells with anyone, and concentrate on the West Street quarter. Those other men were apparently foreign." "Sure, no problem. And if I find him?" "Ring me and steer well clear, understand? No contact with him. He may be an innocent party, but just as easily, he may be very unpleasant." As Kat stood up to leave, Nikki added, "And keep this just between us for present, okay?" Kat tapped the side of her nose. "Got it, Mom. I'll be silent as the grave." As the young detective closed the door, Nikki looked back to the photograph of Martin Durham. She was getting sidetracked by Joseph's problems, but Martin was dead, and Joseph was alive and troubled. Somehow, she'd find time for both. Chapter 9. The Hammer and Anvil pub was packed with celebrating police officers and civilians. "They don't need much encouragement, do they?" yelled Dave above the ear-splitting noise of voices and music. Joseph forced a grin. He had not wanted to come, but he was part of the team now, and he didn't want to let Kat or Dave down. "What are you having, mate?" he asked. "I'm fine, Sarge. I've got a pint and that'll do me." He pointed towards the bar. "The first drink goes on the DI slate, and as that doesn't happen too often, I'd have a large one if I were you." Joseph eased between the packed tables and found that the bar was least crowded right at the far end. As he shouldered his way into the queue, he decided that this kind of gathering really wasn't his thing. He'd do the rounds, smile, speak to everyone he knew, then quietly disappear. "As I stand no chance of ever reaching the bar, would you be kind enough to get me a G&T while you're there, Joseph?" He spun around and saw Bryony standing behind him. "My pleasure, although I could be some time by the look of this lot." "I'll be over by the door to the restaurant. It's quieter there. Do you need a ball of string to find your way back to me?" she asked with a smile. "Don't worry, I came first in orienteering." He returned the smile, then added, "Although I was only 12 at the time." She melted into the crowd, and when Joseph had recovered from the surprise at seeing her, he wondered if she were alone, or maybe waiting for someone. Did women go to rowdy pubs alone these days? Maybe they did. He was pretty out of touch with the social scene. Finally, with their drinks firmly grasped in both hands, he found her. "What on earth is going on?" "The old bill is celebrating slinging a few more villains in the slammer." Her brow wrinkled, and he thought it made her look even more attractive. "What?" "Arrests. We've made some good arrests today." "Ah, so you are a policeman." Joseph smiled sheepishly and hoped that she wouldn't throw up her hands and run screaming from the pub. "Afraid so." "Ah, I was wondering what you did for a living." Relief swept over him, so she'd been thinking about him too. "Actually, we've met before the fitness club, I mean, but I don't think you'd remember me. You were pretty poorly." It was Joseph's turn to frown. "I must have been half dead not to remember you." Bryony laughed. "You probably were. I was at the hospital a few months ago. I was visiting my brother. It was curlew ward, wasn't it?" He nodded. "But I'm really sorry. You see, I don't remember much about the first few days there. I was pretty out of it." "It's all right. Are you fully recovered?" She laughed again. "Silly question. You'd hardly be slinging villains in the slammer if you were still incapacitated now, would you?" "Probably not, although I am very passionate about my job." "I like passion." Bryony grinned broadly, picked up her drink and raised it in salute. "Cheers, Joseph." "Indeed." He clinked his glass against hers. "This is too weird. You know, I'd fully intended to accost you at the pool tomorrow and ask you if you'd like to go for a drink, and voila, here we are." "Funny that. I had the same plan, although I was going to give you one chance to get in first, for the sake of your male pride." Joseph felt his stomach give a little lurch. "So, I assume you would have said yes." "Assume nothing, Joseph. It doesn't pay." She looked him full in the eyes. "Except on this occasion." "I'm glad to hear that, Bryony. So, how come you're here tonight?" Don't ask. She gave him a mock frown. Today has been a catalogue of disasters, although this seems to be making up for it somewhat. She sipped her drink. For my sins, my boss has organised myself and a work colleague to arrange a charity event. We're supposed to be scouting out suitable pubs for a scavenger hunt. My boss never gives me jobs like that. Some might say that was a very enjoyable task. And it might have been, if we hadn't picked one that was evacuated because a fire alarm went off, another that was full of hairy bikers, and in the one before this, my friend had a pint of lager tipped all over her and went home in a huff. This was the last one, so I thought I'd check it out and get it over with, and found all this going on. She pulled her face. I was just on my way out, when I saw you. Detective Sergeant Joseph Easter to the rescue, madam. He held out his hand. Bryony Barton, ex-damsel in distress. Thank you. She took his hand and bowed her head, then laughed out loud. Can we go somewhere quieter, or is it obligatory to stay until you're asked? Not in the slightest, but tradition demands that I must just congratulate the arresting officers. Then I'm all yours. He stood up. Excuse me. I'll be back in 5.
Niall leant on the bar and dug Yvonne sharply in the ribs. Gossip alert, gossip alert. For God's sake, Niall, mind my drink. You know, for a trendy young geezer, you were the biggest old woman on the force. Shut up and look. The Sarge is chatting up that super cool bird in the blue dress. Are you sure she's not chatting him up? He is probably the best-looking bloke in Greenborough. Niall snorted. I'm devastated. I thought you loved me, Vonnie. Of course I do, in a motherly kind of way. Yvonne placed her glass on the bar and tried not to stare across to where Joseph Easter sat talking animatedly to the striking-looking woman. Good luck to you, she thought. After all you've been through, you deserve a bit of fun. Niall was still talking. Well, I don't know what the DI will make of that. Dear me, whatever is he thinking of? Yvonne threw him a puzzled look. What are you rambling on about? Half a shandy and you're practically incoherent. You can't be suggesting that Holy Joe and old Nick are an item, are you? Are you quite mad? Oh, Vonnie, don't be naive. They're meant for each other. Huh? The sergeant and the DI? I've never heard anything so balmy. 5 quid says she's going to be pissed off as hell when she finds out about this. You're on, honey child, although I'm going to hate to take your pocket money quite so easily. Where is DI Galena, anyway? Yvonne took a big gulp of her wine. I saw her going into the super's office just before we left, but she'll be along soon. She glanced back and raised her eyebrows. Uh-oh, looks like the good sergeant is tired of our company already, and who could blame him? That woman has one heck of a good figure. I'll second that, whispered Niall. Put your eyeballs back in, Niall, and try to stop drooling. Sorry, Mother. Fancy another? My turn. Yvonne took her purse from her bag and watched with a smile as the sergeant escorted the woman to the door, and they both disappeared into the street. Joseph took Bryony to a small Italian restaurant where they shared a carafe of house red and ate a chef's special of 4-cheese ravioli and salad. At around 10, she said she had an early start the next day, so Joseph walked her down to the taxi rank. Will you be at the pool tomorrow? He asked hopefully. Not tomorrow. I have to go to Gainsborough for a meeting, but I'll be there on Friday. I'll see you there then. For a moment, he felt like a tongue-tied kid, scared to say the wrong thing, but desperate to get the girl to see him again. And when I do, perhaps you would accept an invitation to dinner on Saturday evening. Ask me on Friday, Joseph, and thank you for being my saving grace tonight. Any time. A taxi moved slowly up the rank towards them. My number. He handed her a card and gave her a brief peck on the cheek. He wanted to kiss her, really kiss her, but then it was too late. Bryony was leaning towards the driver's window and telling him an address on the far side of town, one that Joseph immediately made a mental note of. He opened the door for her and watched her get in. As he closed the door, he glanced across the road to the railway station buildings and saw a man standing in the shadows, watching them intently. He was hardly visible, but Joseph caught sight of a dull gleam of pale hair in the orange glow of a street lamp. "What's wrong, Joseph?" asked Bryony. There was a tinge of concern in her voice. "You're as white as a sheet." "A man. Over there." He pointed. "Where?" She cast her eyes this way and that. "He's gone. You didn't see him?" Joseph tried to get the panic out of his voice. "Sorry, no. Who is he?" "No one." He covered his anxiety with a smile. No one at all. See you Friday. Take care and thank you for tonight.
Bryony looked at him for a long while, then smiled back. Good night, Joseph. As the car pulled away, she called from the open window. Got a good memory. Remember this. Then she called out her telephone number, and the window closed, and she was gone. Joseph grabbed a pen from his pocket, wrote the number on his hand, and watched the car until it turned on the high street. Then he sprinted across the road. He paced up and down the railway approach, looked in every hiding place, and tried doors to see if any were open, but the station was deserted. This time, he really wasn't sure about what he'd seen. The shadows had concealed the figure. All he knew was that someone had been there, and he had slipped out of sight quickly enough for Bryony not to see him. After one last look around, Joseph gave up and walked back towards the taxi rank. As he got close, he decided that he could not face being shut inside a cab. It was a fair distance, but he'd walk. He had so much on his mind he could do with the time alone to try to make sense of things. He pushed his hands deep into his pockets and strode off in the direction of his lodgings. As he walked into the night, all he wanted to think about was Bryony, but try as he might, every time he remembered the outline of her face, it was overpowered by the ugly, uneven features of Billy Sweet. Chapter 10.
Good morning, Sergeant.
Nikki's voice echoed across the CID room.
My office, please.
Joseph felt distinctly as if he'd been summoned for a caning by the head mistress. He closed the door and looked at her speculatively.
Mom? A friendly word to the wise, my friend. Next time you plan an assignation, try to arrange it in a different pub to one that contains half the Fenland Constabulary. I've heard nothing else since I got in.
But, Joseph spluttered, but it wasn't an assignation, Mom. She was there by chance, and I know her from the fitness club. Like me, she swims most mornings. That's all.
Oh, really? But you'd left before I even made it as far as the pub front door, and together, I hear, or has the grapevine got it wrong?
Well, yes, no.
Joseph felt like a total idiot. For some reason, he hadn't thought about what his colleagues would say the next day, and clearly, they were saying a lot. He looked up miserably and saw his boss grinning at him.
Well done. At least that may quell some of the other things they say about you. Those messroom gossips won't have a leg to stand on now, when they call you Holy Joe or Mr. Goody-Two-Shoes.
Thanks for reminding me, Mom, but I thought they'd already given up on that.
They probably have. I wouldn't know. I don't pay the slightest attention to them anyway.
She smiled up at him.
Why should I? While they're snapping at you, they're leaving me alone. I just couldn't resist having a little dig myself. Frankly, I'm pig sick that I miss seeing her. Quite a looker, I hear.
Joseph groaned and sank down into a chair.
I'm beginning to wish I'd given last night a miss.
No, you're not, and you know it. She leant forward. What's she like, Joseph?
A small smile spread across his face.
She's gorgeous.
More? I need details.
Well, her name is Bryony Barton. She's 30, and she works for the public analyst here in Greenborough. Funnily enough, she saw me first when I was in the hospital. Her brother was in the same ward.
And she has a good sense of humour, likes the theatre, dogs and walking barefoot in the sand at sunset.
Joseph tried to look aggrieved, but it was so rare that D.I. Galena openly enjoyed something so much, he didn't have the heart to stop her.
Well, we did talk, and we seemed to have quite a lot in common, but...
Joseph stopped as Cat Cullen appeared in the doorway.
Mom, sorry to interrupt, but...
Joseph had expected Cat to take the mickey out of him more than anyone, but to his surprise, her expression was serious, and her tone unusually grave.
Some kids have found a body.
The boss sighed.
Great, as if I hadn't got enough on my plate with Martin's death. What do we know, Cat?
A male, Gov, found in some wasteland off Beale Street. Throat cut. She threw a sideways glance to Joseph, and he didn't like the look on her face.
Thing is, and obviously I haven't seen him yet, but he fits the description of the man that Sergeant Easter is looking for.
Joseph felt a spasm grip his gut. Sweet. Dead. He closed his eyes. When he'd left the army, he'd spent a lot of time trying to make his life right again, trying to understand things on a deeper level. And he'd succeeded. Not through religion, although a lot of his fellow officers thought that was the case, but with a more spiritual approach to life. He opened his eyes again. So why did he feel such delight in hoping that another human being was dead? It went against everything he believed in.
Joseph?
The DI was staring at him.
I said, I think you need to see this.
Yes, of course, Mom.
He stood up. The answer to his own question was clear. Billy Sweet wasn't a human being. To be classed as that, you needed to belong or relate to the nature of mankind, and there was nothing kind about Sweet. He took a deep breath.
Let's go.
The body was still in situ, although an awning had been hastily erected around it to protect the scene and block it from view. Joseph, the DI, and Cat carefully picked their way over stones and rubbish to the covered area.
Ah, the good detective inspector, and my old Fenchester friend Joseph. How are you, dear boy?
Without waiting for an answer, the tall beanpole of a man pushed his wire-rimmed glasses further up onto the bridge of his hawk nose and beamed benignly at Cat.
And we must not forget you, lovely lady, although we haven't yet been introduced.
He peered at the DI. Cat Cullen, meet Professor Rory Wilkinson, Home Office pathologist, forensic science wizard, and the possessor of the darkest sense of humour imaginable, and another expat from Fenchester. She gave him a grim smile.
You forgot your usual slanderous comment about allegedly being a raging queen,
he added, sounding slightly put out at the omission.
Sorry, I'm that.
So what have you got for us?
An interesting one, to be sure, but not pleasant.
Murder can be pleasant?
Murder can be many things, Inspector, said the pathologist enigmatically, but this is not some crime of passion or a fight that got out of hand. This is an execution. Now, if you'd all like to follow me—
Joseph didn't want to follow him anywhere. Joseph wanted to turn his back and walk away. The word execution had sent a ripple of horror down his spine. He had seen too many executions, and he still saw them, when sleep would not come or when a nightmare took possession of his slumbers. Rory Wilkinson moved beneath the cordon, lifted the canvas flap to the awning, and invited them inside as cordially as if they were a garden party.
Mind yourselves, the ground is somewhat uneven, and the copious quantity of blood doesn't help either.
Joseph breathed in, held his breath, and moved reluctantly into the temporary shelter. No one spoke immediately. Even the garrulous pathologist seemed somewhat in awe of his newest acquisition. The man lay on his side, his knees bent, ankles tightly tied with some kind of thin rope, and his hands tied in the same manner behind his back. He had been made to kneel for his last moments on this earth. His throat had been sliced from ear to ear, and he had fallen sideways, allowing his lifeblood to ooze onto the weeds and the detritus of the waste ground. Bile rose in Joseph's throat. This was something that belonged in his past, something he had prayed that he would never see again. He swallowed, and steeled himself to look at the body. A black nylon bomber jacket, old jeans, a T-shirt, though the blood had made its original colour impossible to see, and scuffed and worn trainers. Unsteadily, he took a few steps backwards, then ducked out under the canvas to drag in some gulps of fresh air. The dead man was ugly, had a rough-cut thatch of corn-coloured hair, uneven features and pale blue eyes. But he wasn't Billy Sweet. Nikki sat in the car and stared across at him.
You are sure?
Absolutely. I've never seen that man before.
Joseph looked pale and gaunt,
although there is a resemblance.
Could it have been the man that you think has been following you?
No, Mom. The man I saw was Billy Sweet. His lips drew tighter, but thinking about it, the dead guy may have been the man I saw hanging around the station buildings last night. Beale Street is only a few minutes from there.
He rubbed hard at his temple.
If only there had been some kind of identification on him, muttered Joseph. It would have given us somewhere to start.
Nikki shrugged. No such luck. We'll just have to wait for the fingerprint check, a photo image identification, and failing all that, DNA tests. She took a deep breath. And you have to consider that this may have nothing whatsoever to do with you or this guy who has been watching you.
Billy killed him.
Joseph's voice was little more than a monotone.
I've seen his work before.
You mean this Billy Sweet is already killed in this manner? Asked Nikki incredulously.
Oh, yes.
Joseph gave a small, humourless laugh.
It was a kind of hobby of his. You're making me feel sick, said Nikki through gritted teeth. So now you know why I'm half out of my mind at the thought of him being here in Greenborough, amongst people I care about.
And the only connection that we know about to Billy Sweet and Greenborough is you, Joseph. Nikki bit on the side of her thumbnail. I think it's time to take this back to the station. We'll set up the murder room, then go over everything that we know so far. And Joseph? She looked at him with real concern in her eyes, and although she did not want to compound his problems, she knew that she had to ask some questions that he would find hard to cope with. You do know that we are going to have to go over some pretty unpleasant stuff, don't you? About your past? Joseph slumped back into his seat, as if all his energy had sapped away and left only a limp shell. Then we're going to need a very large bottle of scotch and a tape recorder, because if I do manage to talk to you, the story will be told once, and only once. Okay? I'll buy the whiskey, said Nikki flatly, and for your sake, I think this part will be best dealt with away from the station, don't you? She gave him an inquiring look. So, your place or mine? Have you seen my place, Mom? He answered, showing a hint of the old Joseph. Then Cloud Fen it is. After we've done the preliminaries back at the Nick, 7 o'clock, and bring a toothbrush. You won't be driving afterwards.
Chapter 11. Nikki left the others preparing the murder room, went to her office and closed the door. She needed some time alone to try to get her head around what was happening. Martin Durham's unexplained suicide still haunted her. Over and over she saw him, riding off down the lane on his bicycle, waving to her. He'd said he had something to tell her, a little bit of interesting news. His face had been alive, bright. Then apparently he had prepared a stew for lunch, jumped into his car and driven to Greenborough, where a few hours later he lay dead in the stinking mud of the Wayland River. Nikki gave a shaky little sigh. She'd read somewhere that suicide was a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Could something that terrible have happened between the hours of 7:30 a.m. and midday? Something awful enough to make Martin Durham kill himself? She reached across and picked up the old picture that was still propped against her monitor. She felt sad now that she had seen him so infrequently while she was staying in the town. He had been a great support to both her and Hannah when her ex-husband Robert left home. Not pushy, not intrusive, just there. And now he'd gone, and she owed it to him to put the record straight. She didn't want him written off as some flaky sado, because he was far from that, and maybe she were the only one who would have the incentive and the wherewithal to bring the truth to light. "Hang on in there, Martin," she whispered. "Things have gone a little mad here right now, but I'll find out what happened. I promise." "First sign of madness, Nikki, talking to yourself." She had been so engrossed in her own thoughts that she hadn't even heard Rick Bainbridge enter her office. She grinned ruefully. "And what is the second sign, Super? Because I'm sure to be displaying it." "I'm not sure. Something about looking for hairs on your palms, I think." He stared at the picture that was still in her hand. "Who's in the photo?" She passed it across for the superintendent to see. "My old neighbour Martin Durham, Hannah, and I." "I never realised that you were that close." He scrutinised the snap, then handed it back to her. "We were just good neighbours, sir. Kind of there for each other. Cloud Fen is a small outlying community. It's what you do." "Then no doubt his loss will hit hard." Nikki nodded. "He was a good man. He will be missed." She stared up at the superintendent and was pretty sure it was not Martin that he wanted to talk about. As if on cue, he sat down and said, "But that's not why I'm here. I want your honest opinion on Sergeant Easter." Nikki was somewhat taken aback. She had been sure it would be a request for a report on the dead man, but Joseph... "Why? What's wrong?" The super's brow wrinkled into furrows. "I'm concerned that he's come back too soon, Nikki. I saw him yesterday and I didn't like the look on his face. He seemed totally distracted by something." Nikki thought quickly. If Joseph's possible involvement with the dead man came to light too soon, the superintendent would have them off the case before she could draw breath. "Ah, I see the grapevine hasn't stretched its sticky little tendrils in your direction yet, sir." She mustered a broad smile. Joseph has got a new flame, and if the rest of the station is right, he has every right to look preoccupied, sir. Apparently she's a stunner." "Joseph?" "The one and the same." "Good Lord." "My sentiments precisely. But don't worry about him, sir. He's still on the ball regarding his work. He's been nose to the grindstone ever since he started." She lost the smile. "And we are busy, sir. What with Martin, and now the death in Beale Street.
That was my next question. Is this execution-style murder true, or have the rookies hyped it up?
It's true, sir. Nikki decided to keep her information to the minimum for the time being. I've never seen anything like it before. Professor Wilkinson has said he will prioritise the post-mortem, so we should get his preliminary report pretty quickly.
And we have no idea of the man's identity?
None, but hopefully we'll get some answers soon. Everyone is geared up for the investigation, and the murder room should be ready by now. She looked at him seriously. I'd better get back out there, sir. I'll keep you updated of everything as we go along.
Good. And let me know if you need more detectives. Some of the inquiries being dealt with at present can afford to go on the back burner.
Thanks, Super. I'll ascertain where this is going and let you know. She looked at him hopefully. Do you think Sergeant Conway could spare me a couple of bodies for some legwork? Yvonne and Niall would be a great help if they were free. The Super shook his head, then gave her an exasperated half-smile.
Oh, all right, I'll do my best, but no promises, Nikki. You know that CID should work closely with uniform, not just commandeer their staff as and when.
I'd really appreciate it, sir.
As I said, no promises.
He walked to the door, then turned back, a disbelieving smile playing across his face.
A real stunner, you say?
Absolutely, sir. Haven't seen her myself, but the words that are being bandied around are pretty descriptive. Stunning was the mildest of several very colourful and graphic adjectives.
Oh, I can imagine exactly what kind of words the messroom have come up with, and most of them quite unrepeatable, I should think.
He shook his head again.
Poor old Joseph.
Nikki raised her eyebrows. Hardly, if what I hear is right. It's lucky old Joseph.
Mom?
Joseph looked at her, a puzzled expression on his face.
What's with the Super? I could swear he winked at me.
Oh, dear. You may have me to thank for that.
Thank you for what?
Just think about it, Sergeant. What have half the station been talking about? Until we had a murder land on our patch, that is. Just believe me, what I told the Super is all for the best. Joseph shook his head and remained totally bemused. Nikki turned to Dave. Are we all set up?
Yes, Ma'am, and you've just received a note from Professor Wilkinson.
He handed her an envelope. OK, get everyone together and we'll take a look at what we've got so far. She tore open the envelope and looked at the copperplate script that was Rory Wilkinson's everyday handwriting.
My dear Inspector, as you were tactful enough not to demand an immediate answer to that age-old question, can you give me a time of death, I have made it my business to provide you with a little gift, my closest guesstimate, pre-post-mortem findings, of course. I believe our man was executed, and there is no doubt that is what happened between 10 and 11 o'clock last night. It was quite warm last evening, and although the rigor mortis was advanced, it had not reached the point of full-body rigidity. Our insect friends were naturally enjoying themselves enormously, but the eggs had not hatched into maggots, so we are looking at the fact that he had been dead for less than 12 hours when he and I were introduced. I can also confirm, even without detailed examination, that your killer is right-handed. The incised wound was made by the killer standing behind the victim, and the cut extends from high up close to the ear, sweeps downwards across the throat, then back up again. The cut is left to right, indicating a right-handed assailant. It was a clean, efficient, and highly effective move, so alas, I suspect this is not the first time that this person has used this particular procedure. See, it pays not to hassle your friendly pathologist at the scene of a crime. My opinion and prelim report will be on your desk tomorrow morning, God willing. And now back to my cold cadaver. Felicitations, Rory. MD, BCH, MRCP, FRC Path, lifetime member of the Judy Garland fan club, etc., etc. Nikki smiled to herself. Professor Wilkinson had a reputation for stalling if pressed over the elusive time of death. Although it hadn't been easy, she had purposely refused to ask him his opinion. She now had her answer, and more. She looked up and smiled smugly as the door opened and Yvonne Collins and Niall Farrow walked in. Things were progressing exactly as planned. OK, guys, find a seat and we'll recap on what we know. She walked to the front of the room. And until we get the forensic reports back, we'll stick to the facts. We can throw ideas around when we know more. Nikki drew in a deep breath. Joseph's involvement would stay in the background for now, with one small exception, his jaywalker. Right, last night between the hours of 10 and 11 p.m.
She clearly described everything they had found on the filthy waste ground in Beale Street, and when she paused to gather herself, a low murmur of disbelief greeted her.
"Dear God," muttered Niall. "Sounds like something from Vietnam, not Greenborough."
Nikki silently agreed, then continued.
"He had no identification on him, but his description is approx 5'10", naturally blonde hair, blue eyes, and no distinguishing features other than a small scar on his wrist. No visible tattoos or birthmarks, although the full examination may show something. We have him as about 35, maybe younger." She listed his clothes and watched as they all scribbled down what she said. "Now," she looked at her team, "we are already running a fingerprint check, and his picture will be circulated. But I don't need to tell you that we need to get on top of this really quickly. Whoever killed him is a highly dangerous individual, and we have no idea if this is just a one-off, a personal vendetta, or the start of a killing spree. Whatever, we don't want what appears to be a professional hitman on our streets for long."
A murmur of agreement ran around the room.
"So, we need CCTV checks for that whole area, including the station. Officers out asking questions of local residents and workers, not that there are many, as that spot is pretty low-density housing, and we need a real push on identifying the dead man."
"I was in the vicinity of the station last night, Ma'am," said Joseph slowly. "I saw a man loitering in the shadows and went to investigate, but he had disappeared. I'm not saying it was the same person, and the streetlights drained everything of colour, but I think he had blondish fair hair."
Nikki nodded. "Hopefully there may be some working cameras that will show him up."
She was glad Joseph had mentioned the fact that he was there before the CCTV check began.
"A completely separate incident occurred the day before, again involving Sergeant Easter. Some men were messing around on the high road, dashing in between cars. One of them hammered on the sergeant's windscreen as he was going out to Cloud Fen to conduct an interview. We've got them on camera, but it's very poor quality. The thing is, the man was of the same build and description and wore similar clothes. Maybe coincidence, maybe not."
She looked up and saw Joseph looking at her apprehensively, but she had no intention of telling anyone about the man he had seen in the alley, or of his fears about knowing the identity of an evil man in their midst. All in good time. She wanted to hear the history of Billy Sweet and get Joseph's involvement with him clear in her head, long before she discussed it with the team.
"Okay, sort out who does what between yourselves. I know we're pretty well stuck until we get some reports and some answers back. But do what you can, and try to get some sleep tonight. We could be pretty busy until we catch this killer."
She turned to Joseph.
"Come with me. There are a few details I need to discuss while the others organise themselves."
In her office, she told him about the super, noticing that he wasn't himself.
"He must have seen you after you spotted your mystery man in the lane. He thought you'd come back too soon, and I have to say that you did look like shit."
"I probably did." Joseph sighed. "Ah, right, so you told him I was love-struck."
"It was the first thing that came into my mind, and it worked. So if he winks at you again, don't worry. He's not a friend of Dorothy. Just run with it. I need you here with me, not being sent on extended R&R again."
She scratched her head thoughtfully.
"By the way, did your new woman, what's her name?"
"Bryony."
"Oh, yes, Bryony. Did she see this shadowy figure?"
"No. He disappeared as soon as I pointed towards him."
"Shame. It would have helped to have another pair of eyes see him."
"Tell me about it," he grumbled, but she was in the cab by that time, and the station buildings were not in her line of vision.
"When are you seeing her again?"
The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them.
"Sorry, Joseph, it's none of my damn business what you do. Hell, I must have sounded like your mother."
"Believe me, you are nothing like my mother."
Joseph gave her a rueful smile.
"And to be honest, I'd planned on seeing her at the pool tomorrow, work permitting, and I was going to ask her out for dinner on Saturday evening. But now I'm not sure if I should be planning anything, with Billy Sweet out there."
She looked at him for a while, then gave a little shrug.
"I'm not sure what I'd do, but as I said, it's none of my business, and I shouldn't have asked."
For some reason that she couldn't explain, not even to herself, she really didn't want to know about Bryony.
"Now, I'd really better chase up these fingerprints."
He stood up to go.
"Do you like pasta?"
she asked suddenly. "My favourite. Why?"
"Tonight, my cooking skills are hardly legendary, but my pasta is reasonably edible, and if it is rubbish, hopefully enough scotch should make it seem passable."
"I'm sure it will be great," said Joseph. "Did you mean it about the toothbrush?"
"Oh, yes. No way you were leaving Cloud Fen tonight, Sergeant, and I haven't just spent a fortune doing up the guest room to have no one stay in it."
Joseph didn't answer immediately, but just nodded as he went out, then turned and said, "Thanks. I do appreciate it. This won't be easy." Nikki felt a pang of sadness. She'd been in some seriously bad places herself in the past. "I know, Joseph, and if there was any other way, but if people are going to die, I have no choice, do I?" "I'm afraid you don't." She touched his arm lightly. "But that doesn't make it any easier, does it?" "No one in their right mind would want to walk back into a nightmare. Let's just hope it turns out to be a cathartic experience, shall we?" Nikki watched him leave and shivered, because she knew that whatever kind of experience Joseph was going to have, it was going to be far from cathartic. Chapter 12. Joseph crunched the gears and uncharacteristically swore out loud. He should take more care on these lethal marsh lanes. They concealed insidious little bends that sneaked out of nowhere, and with the tall, reedy marsh grass on the boggy verges and the deep ditches either side. He shivered. If you finished up in a ditch, you could be there for a week before someone found you. With an effort, he pulled himself together and tried to relax. Pretend it's just supper with a good friend, a few drinks, then a few more, and let the alcohol loosen the tongue. Share some deep secrets, have another drink, and crash out. Simple. He laughed bitterly. He hadn't done that for many a year, not since. He abruptly brought his thoughts to a halt. It was far too soon to be going there. Joseph slowed down and made himself take in the view over this weird water world. It certainly was a strange place, and he wasn't sure if he loved it or hated it. For one thing, it was rare to find a place that completely wrecked your sense of perspective. You could go up on the sea bank, and if the wind would allow you to stand upright and see clearly, you could stare into infinity. Or so the long, straight paths that disappeared into the horizon would have you believe. The marshes, the rivers, the great endless fields, and the ever-present 360 degrees of sky could reflect and magnify your moods like no other place he had ever seen, and he had travelled more than most. If you were sad, the remoteness echoed your misery, but if you were happy, the sheer magnitude of the sky above, the clouds forming new landscapes every moment, could lift you to unimaginable heights. With every trip he made, he felt more confused about it. He smiled to himself. One thing was certain. Galena loved it. She was a different person when she was out here. She belonged, and Joseph could feel her closeness to the place. He dropped a gear and eased around one of those long and incredibly deceiving bends before continuing his train of thought. The boss and Cloud Fen. It was quite strange. Nikki Galena was a tough, independent woman and a bloody good copper. She might have tempered down her tunnel-visioned obsession for ridding the streets of drug dealers, but she was still steely and driven, someone who you would place in a city, or at very least a town like Greenborough, not out here in these misty groves of solitude. Maybe she needed them, to rid her mind of the grim happenings that her job insisted she deal with on a daily basis. Maybe this was her security blanket. Perhaps she wrapped herself in the sea frets to free herself from the dreadful things that man did to man. A place of escape. Joseph smiled and sighed. In the distance, he could see the outline of Cloud Cottage Farm, and he felt both relieved that he'd survived the marsh lanes and apprehensive about what the night may bring. The farmhouse looked welcoming. Evening sunlight glinted off the windows, and he thought that it would be good to arrive home each night and find something like this waiting for you. Good but not perfect, because, after years of being alone, he was coming to realize that alone wasn't what he wanted. It suited the boss, and until recently it would have suited him. He turned onto the lane that led to her home, and wondered why his change of heart. It had to be his brush with the Grim Reaper. Joseph slowed down and saw the gates were wide open for him. It was time to let the melancholy stuff go. Time to paint on another face. He swung in and parked around the back of the property, next to a big old red brick barn. He jumped out, took a deep breath of the ozone-laden air, then went round and retrieved a bulging plastic bag and a small overnighter from the boot. At least he had the first part of the evening planned, even though he knew it was purely a diversionary tactic. He would salvage the meal. If the boss was such a pants cook, she would relish his help, and he loved to cook. Chopping and dicing, blending and sautéing was his way to unwind, to escape. He walked around to the back door, recalling what she had told him about no one using the front, and vaguely wondered why he had bothered to lock the car. As he waited for her to answer his knock, he decided that some therapeutic cooking would definitely serve him well, because if there were ever a time he needed to relax, it was now.
"Okay, so where did you learn to do all that?" asked the boss, clearly impressed. "And so quickly. I'd still be reading the instructions on the pasta packet." Joseph glanced down at the old pine table, now colourful with bowls of steaming pasta and sauce, green salad, tomatoes and olives, and richly aromatic garlic and herb bread. "College. I'd seen some of my fellow students' pasty faces and pimples, and decided that I was going to pass out with diplomas and degrees, not malnutrition and scurvy." He picked up a bottle of Merlot that had been left to breathe while he cooked. "Red okay for you, Mom?" "Red, pink, white. All okay for me, thank you." The boss sighed happily and took 2 glasses down from a Welsh dresser. "And we're off duty tonight, Joseph, so on this occasion, Nikki is fine." He poured the wine into the glasses and held his up to hers. "Cheers, Nikki." "To you, Joseph." The crystal made a small ringing sound. "You have no idea how much better this meal is than the one I had planned." "I doubt it, Nikki. I'm sure you are a perfectly good cook. It's just not your thing, that's all." "Not quite what my daughter used to tell me, but hey, let's eat." Halfway through the meal, Joseph lay down his napkin. "I just wanted to say thank you for not making me fess up to my past in front of the team." He sipped his wine. "Frankly, I don't think I could have done it." "That would have been incredibly insensitive," said Nikki. "I may be a hard-ass cow at times, and I want to catch the killer, but not at the expense of my sergeant." Joseph nodded. There was something about the atmosphere in the old kitchen. They were sitting, talking, as dozens of others must have done over several generations, and it felt warm and intimate. "You do know that you are probably the only person I could share this with, don't you?" Nikki looked at him across the top of her glass. "Well, I guess we've been through a couple of pretty emotive situations in the short time we've known each other." She smiled at him. "And you were the one to accompany me down where it's twisted and dark when I needed to offload. So I guess it's just a reversal of roles this time." Joseph decided that he felt very comfortable in this old room with the pine furniture, the butler sink, the pottery chickens, and the ancestral memories. He poured some more wine, and they finished their supper. "Does cognac keep?" she asked as he stacked plates into the dishwasher. "Not in my house, but that's just due to my propensity for fine brandy." "Why?" "When the builders were clearing the attic to work on the wiring and the installation, they found some old boxes belonging to my father. I brought them down to sort out and found an unopened bottle of cognac." She raised an eyebrow at him. "Worth a try, do you think?" "Is it ever? What's on the label?" "Several layers of dust, I should think." She opened the larder and removed a tall, straight bottle with 2 rather scuffed and faded off-white labels on the front. Joseph carefully took it from her, and his eyes widened. "We can't drink this." "Oh, gone off, has it? Then we'll revert back to the whiskey, and I'll pour that down the sink."
"No!"
Joseph almost choked at the threat of tipping the spirit away.
"This is Croisette 1961. It's rare, Nikki, and would probably cost you over £300 to buy."
"God, my father is a sneaky old devil. What on earth was he squirreling that away for?" She stared at the bottle in disbelief, then grinned and said, "Oh well, at least it's drinkable. I'll get a couple of balloon glasses and we can do it properly." Joseph touched the bottle with something like reverence, then laughed out loud at his boss's total disregard for the heritage of such a fine spirit. But who was he to complain? He'd tasted some fine brandy before, but this would be a first. Nikki returned from the lounge, glasses in hand. "You do the honours, Joseph. The way I look at it is this. I never even knew it was there. My poor father doesn't know what year it is anymore. Sadly, he doesn't even know his only daughter, so he won't be objecting. And if I'd never returned to live here, then that bottle would either have been left in the attic for some other bugger to lift, or taken to the dump, so— Let's say the house is welcoming you home, shall we?" "I like that. Want to go through to the sitting room, or would you rather stay here?"
"Stay here," he replied without even thinking. "I love the feel to this room."
"That's what my mother always said. She said it felt safe, and even if she was on her own, she felt as if the family were around her." As Joseph carefully unsealed the bottle, he knew exactly what the perceptive woman had meant. "Okay, here goes nothing." He poured the amber liquid into the brandy balloons and gently sniffed one of them. "Oh my, that is something else. Let's hope its anesthetic properties are as good as its bouquet." Nikki took hers from him and sipped it tentatively. "No way would I pay 300 quid for it, but it is very nice. Thank you, Daddy." Joseph was lost for words. He just sat there smiling inanely and wishing he had been born to an indecently wealthy French family.
The silence that engulfed them was as comfy as a pair of old slippers, and Joseph suddenly knew that he had run out of excuses. There was nothing left to come between him and the horrors of the past.
You said that when you go through a difficult time with someone, you feel very close to them afterwards, or words to that effect.
He stared into the glinting crystal goblet.
So I think you'll understand when I say that it was like that with my army comrades. They say you're brothers in arms, but that doesn't even get close. Those men are everything to you. You love them in a way that...
He paused, looking for the right words, but not truly finding them.
You've got to have been part of something like that to know just how much your mates mean to you.
He took another sip of the cognac and looked across at his boss. He had the feeling that she was going to be a good listener. It took a very special person just to listen and not butt in, criticize, or compare your story to something from their own past.
It was never my intended career, but I loved being a soldier, Nikki, and I was a good one.
A sigh slipped from between his lips.
A natural.
I can believe that, said Nikki softly. I've seen how you react under pressure. He nodded, and wondered how long he could make one sip of that rare cognac last.
You already knew that I was with UK Special Forces, but I was actually part of an elite team that dealt with very delicate special ops, and I thrived on it, Nikki, until Billy Sweet poisoned everything.
He gripped his glass tightly, and his next drink was more of a slug than a sip. He knew that Nikki's company, his relaxed surroundings, and the brandy were making the telling of this story as easy as it would ever be, but he still wanted to run away before he had to fully enter that dreadful pit of memory. Nikki seemed to sense his difficulty and reached across to refill his glass. You had a bad mission, didn't you? Where were you?
Africa,
he whispered. There was no turning back. Joseph set his jaw firmly forward.
I know it's sweet that you are interested in, but to appreciate what happened you have to know a bit about what we were doing.
He took a deep breath.
4 of us were sent out to the Democratic Republic of Congo to look for a small unit of men who had disappeared without trace.
He swallowed hard as the filthy smells and the stinking heat rushed back at him.
The country was a living nightmare. Hell on earth. Massacres, child soldiers, systematic rape, and a refugee crisis that helped to destabilize the whole of the eastern Congo. It was worse than anything I'd ever seen, and I'd been in some shitholes before.
He swirled the cognac around and around in the glass and tried to lose himself in the topaz vortex.
No matter what I say, Nikki, it could never convey how terrible it was. But try to imagine this. In the area where we were deployed, 3/4 of all the children had disappeared. 3/4.
He closed his eyes and tried not to hear the heart-rending wails of the women. So why were the first group out there? Prompted Nikki, trying to keep her voice steady.
It was to do with precious metals and minerals. The whole place is a great big geological treasure chest, but greed and the conflict have just left it like one blasted, shameful battlefield. The group had been sent to a village called Zutu. There was a mine there, one that was being overseen by European scientists and engineers. It had rich seams of valuable minerals, not just gold, copper, or diamonds, even though they were common enough. They were mining minerals like niobium, pyrochlor, coltan, and germanium, all needed by high-tech industries, like for nuclear reactors or space technology.
Joseph shivered a little, even though the kitchen was still warm.
We knew that one of the scientists had been murdered, and 2 engineers were missing. That's why the first group went out, to get the remaining staff to safety and find and bring home the missing men.
But they had disappeared too.
They accomplished their mission, retrieved the hostages, and got the rest of the staff extracted by helicopter. But they went back to Zutu.
Nikki frowned, but said nothing.
They contacted HQ with their coordinates, saying that they had discovered something else, something that intelligence had not briefed them about.
Joseph shifted uncomfortably in his chair.
After that, they sent just one communication, regarding a neighbouring village called Ituga, a terrifying report about women and children being taken as slaves and forced to open-cast mine minerals, sometimes with their bare hands, and give everything they found to their rebel captors. These women were also expected to prostitute themselves, and if they refused, you can guess what happened to them. The unit's plan was to recon the other mine, assess the potential for an evacuation, and either request assistance or deal with it immediately. It was a covert mission, an imperative that the identity of the sponsor was concealed. It couldn't be known that the British government was involved, not in that hotbed of political shit. He drank more brandy. My team was Kilo Charlie 0. We were a 4-man patrol, and we shipped out as soon as communication with the Tuga broke down. Joseph stood up and walked slowly around the kitchen, touching ordinary homely objects, as if trying to ground himself in the present. We found the unit in a cave close to the mine. 3 of them had been butchered, and the 4th was sitting there with the bodies, too traumatized to speak. He ran his hand across the cold surface of a marble chopping block. I'd served with one of them before, Terry Bourne. He was a fine soldier and an extraordinary human being. A picture of the tussle-haired man with a boxer's nose and a big smile came unbidden into his thoughts, rough and tough on the outside, but inside, a rare gentleman. We radioed our findings in, got the bodies to a place of safety ready to be brought home, and took the remaining soldier with us. We requested a helicopter evacuation for him and our dead, but there was heavy rebel fighting close by, and they wouldn't comply. My commanding officer made the decision that we go in and finish the job ourselves.
Find out what was going on at the Etuga mine?
Yeah, and send back full intelligence.
Joseph sighed.
And that's where it all went pear-shaped.
He flopped back down into his chair.
I'm not sure if any of us really knew what happened, but we got a radio message telling us that a group of rebels had been seen bringing in a new batch of women and children. According to our information, they were being held in a large hut prior to selection for duties, and the rebels were regrouping, ready for their next sortie in a cave close to the perimeter of the mine.
Joseph licked his lips and steeled himself to speak.
Our intel was wrong. It was the women who were in the cave that we attacked. Somehow in the bedlam that followed, we managed to get only 2 of the women out. Most of them died.
He glanced across at Nikki's face. It was set as if in stone, and he had no idea what she was thinking. And the children?
She finally asked. There were no children this time.
Nikki's face softened. Thank God for small mercies. And Billy Sweet, where does he fit in? Joseph took another gulp of his drink. This was the worst bit, the bit he had relegated to the deepest, darkest part of his memory. The accidental killing of the women had been devastating, life-destroying. But what had come next was the stuff of nightmares. He rubbed his hand across his mouth.
We were hopelessly outnumbered, and we'd lost the element of surprise. We fell back, taking the 2 women and the silent soldier.
He stood up again and began to pace.
As night fell, we found a deserted building, an old shelter, a store of some kind. It was way outside the perimeter and well hidden.
Joseph saw it in his mind's eye, saw the sun-bleached wood and the corrugated metal sheets that served as a roof. And suddenly, he was there again, back in Africa.
All clear,
he called out as he checked the last part of the deserted shack. He relaxed a little, but kept his rifle at the ready.
Get the women inside. It'll get cold pretty quickly.
He stood back as his comrades entered the building.
It's going to be a long night, Bunny.
His friend, Cameron McBride, hitched up a rag of material that was hung at the glassless window and tried to decide how best to keep guard until morning.
The terrain sucks. Too many dead spots for snipers to hide in. 2-hour watches, 2 men awake at all times, I reckon.
Yeah.
They called him Bunny because of his surname. He was the Easter Bunny.
I'll take first watch.
Me too, added Teddy Churchill, wiping grime and other unspeakable substances from his boots.
I'll sort out some rations, get the women and this lad fed.
Kenny Williams' dirty face crinkled up in frustration.
Daren't risk a fire, though. It's cold grub or nothing.
Joseph's stomach was in no fit state for food, hot or cold, and he was grateful to get outside into the night. The bloodbath in the mine was still playing itself out in his head. How could everything have gone so wrong? He was still hearing the screams echoing around in his mind when Teddy sidled up to him and whispered,
"There's movement down on the track, 500 meters south."
They moved together into the darkness and watched the narrow road. Joseph flipped down his night vision sights and saw figures huddled in the scrubby trees that flanked the track.
Go get Cam and Kenny.
Moments later, the 4 soldiers eased themselves further down the incline to get a better look at their ghostly intruders. They watched for a while, then Cam tapped his arm and gestured towards the shadows.
"They are women, thank God. Some of them must have escaped." "Are they alone?"
whispered Kenny.
"Can't see."
"Bait," murmured Teddy grimly. "It's a trap."
Joseph suddenly froze. Or a lure, to get us away from the shack. Cam inhaled sharply, then said,
No, the squaddie's with them. The girls will be all right. He's a mess, but he's still a soldier.
His confidence faded.
Surely they wouldn't.
I'm going back. Joseph knew something was terribly wrong. One of you come with me. As he begun to climb back up towards the shack, he felt Cam move in behind him.
Bad vibes, man.
Joseph didn't answer. Like wraiths in the night, they drifted up to the door and slipped inside. The coppery, metallic smell hit them instantly, and it was something they were both horribly familiar with. Then they heard the sound, a weird sing-song keening, like nothing Joseph had ever heard, either before or since.
Oh God,
whispered Cam. The women were dead. They had been hog-tied and their throats neatly slit, and sitting on his haunches in front of them, rocking backwards and forwards, was the young soldier. When he realized that he was no longer alone, the horrible noise that was issuing from his throat ceased, and for the first time since they arrived in Atuga, he spoke. Actually, he screamed.
They made me watch! The bastards made me watch!
Joseph stared at him.
They were waiting. They came in. They came in as soon as you'd gone.
And you let them do this?
Cam's voice was even louder.
I couldn't do anything,
blubbered the young man.
And they left you alone, did they? I don't fucking think so.
Cam sneered at the soldier.
You ran away, didn't you? You shitty little coward. You left these women to be slaughtered and you hid.
Until then, Joseph had said nothing. Then he asked, What's your name, soldier?
Sweet, sir. Billy Sweet. And I didn't run. They held me and made me watch, I swear. Then something scared them. They pushed me to the floor and ran off.
Joseph's powerful flashlight lit up the man's eyes, and he shivered. It might have been the trauma he had suffered, or it might have been the light. Joseph was never sure, but the soldier had the unblinking pale eyes of a fish. Cold, dead eyes. Suddenly, Joseph was back in the kitchen. His breathing laboured, and Nikki was beside him, pressing the glass into his shaking hands.
Take a sip, Joseph, go on. It's okay. You're okay, honestly.
He took a long, shuddery breath.
Yes, I am, aren't I?
Are you up to finishing the story, or...
I've come this far. Let's get it done with.
He fought to control the shaking.
When it was light, I searched for signs of intruders. There were none. I looked for a knife, but the terrain was too difficult. You see, the others believed he was a coward. I believed he was a murderer.
He stretched, trying to unknot his cramped muscles. A week later, I went back to that area to help mop up the rebels, and I heard talk about a baby-faced white soldier who had killed his own comrades. Joseph looked at Nikki. I knew then I'd been right about Billy Sweet.
He butchered his friends.
Nikki's voice rose several octaves.
And the women.
I believe so, but no witnesses came forward and there was no proof. He was sent for psychological evaluation, given a long holiday somewhere nice, and allowed back on active duty 2 months later.
My God, how come they didn't see through him?
Psychopaths are brilliant and convincing liars. Joseph shrugged. Ironic, isn't it? It was me that finished up on the scrap heap. I couldn't cope with what had happened at the mine. Those poor women died and we killed them. They were supposed to be the rebels. He gave one last sigh. Billy Sweet marched back to war, and I threw my rifle into a river and went home.
You never saw him again?
Just once. A week or so before I got my honourable discharge. I was helping out at a training camp in the Brecon Beacons, and I heard a group of soldiers complaining about one of the men. I heard them mention the name, and I had to go take a look at him. That's how come I know his face. He'd changed, of course. I don't think he was ever as young as he seemed. He got older, got tougher, and uglier. But his eyes were just the same.
Did he see you? And did he recognize you?
Oh, yes. From the derisory smile on his evil face, I'd say, most definitely. Nikki looked across at him, her face drawn and sombre.
And you believe that that was the man who jumped in front of your car in the Greenborough High Road?
When he answered, the words were slow and deliberate. Yes, the man I saw was Billy Sweet. They talked on until 1 a.m. They talked about families, about his soul-searching journey after he left the army, about the police force and of living on the Fen. She talked about Martin, and she even managed to let Joseph talk about Bryony, although she still felt that inexplicable feeling of discomfort deep inside when he mentioned the other woman. Whatever, it was good to have him there. She had told the super that she could take care of herself, and she had never been frightened to be alone. But like it or not, Cloud Fen was a remote spot when there was a violent thug on the loose, and Joseph's presence was a distinct comfort. She had given him the guest room, the room that had been hers as a child, and told him to try to catch the sunrise. The dawn over the marsh was as beautiful as anywhere in the world. As she slipped into her own bed, she thought about Joseph, lying just a few feet away from her, and sighed. She hoped he would see the sun come up, sending dazzling flame fingers across the oily dark waters of the marsh. He could do with some bright light to warm the sadness that lived inside him. Chapter 13. Joseph had certainly seen the sunrise, as he had seen every other hour of the night. It had nothing to do with not being tired. He had been exhausted, totally drained from everything that he had dredged up from the mud of his past. He was simply scared to sleep. He knew only too well the nightmares that were lurking in his head, waiting to crawl and slither into his dream sleep. So he had got to see the dawn, and as Nikki had said, it had been spectacular. For a moment or two, he had been able to lose himself in it, as a deep blood-red orb that was the sun broke free of the dark horizon. He wished he could stay there, basking in its breathtaking beauty, but there was a killer close by, and the time for relaxing would only come when Sweet was behind bars or beneath the ground. Joseph had showered and gone downstairs to find Nikki, already dressed, and trying to prise a hunk of burnt toast from the toaster with a knife. He had declined the offer of a cooked breakfast and settled for coffee and a cold croissant. Then, after thanking her for both her hospitality and the incredibly good brandy, drove away from Cloud Fen and headed towards the swimming pool. He had time for a half-an-hour swim before he started work, and it might help to wash away the shadows that still clung to him. He had just completed his 20th length when the changing-room door opened and Bryony walked in. She waved brightly and went to one of the poolside showers, allowing him time to take in the sight of her. She was wearing a black sports swimsuit with a scarlet flash down the sides and looked every inch the athlete. He ducked under the water for a moment and tried to understand why he felt such an idiotic delight in her being there. "Hi, you," she said as she broke the water inches from his face. "Glad you made it," he said, pushing his wet hair back from his face. "As if I'd miss the chance of seeing you." She grinned at him, then rolled over on her back and glided effortless up the half-empty pool. "Keep up slow, coach." He pushed off and took a few powerful strokes, but he was still not even close to her. Bryony was completely at home in the water and moved through it with both grace and ease. He was not a bad swimmer, although nothing like he had been. Even so, he was not rubbish, but right now he felt like a lumbering whale next to a dolphin. It took him about 10 minutes to find a stroke that enabled him to keep up with her, and even then he was sure that she was slowing down to let him catch her. The water felt good, and he didn't want to leave, but the big clock at the end of the pool was telling him otherwise. "I've got to go." "So soon?" Water glistened on her smooth skin, and Joseph silently cursed the fact that he had to work. "We've got a lot on, I'm afraid." "Big case, Mr. Detective Sergeant." Joseph bit his lip and thought, yeah, big as they come, and the timing stinks. Something like that. He swam on his side towards the steps. "So how about Saturday? Are we on for dinner?" Bryony swam towards him and planted a light kiss on his cheek before plunging down beneath the bright blue water and swimming off. "Take that as a yes, shall I?" he called after her, then realized that he was not supposed to know where she lived. "Where shall I pick you up?" "I'll meet you at 7, outside that dreadful pub of yours," she shouted. He waved to her and pushed open the changing-room door. That was just fine, but this time he'd make sure it was not heaving with policemen. "We've got a match, Joseph." Nikki was already in the murder room and sifting through a pile of fresh reports. "On." He threw his jacket over the back of his chair and moved to her side. "Our execution victim. His name is Chris Forbes. His fingerprints turned up on the police computer. Nothing heavy, just some trouble overtaking a car without the owner's consent." "Was he a local, Mom?" asked Joseph. "Yes, he's from the Carrborough estate. Bit of a rough family, but other than that one incident, he seems to have been clean." She paused, then added, "So why did he finish up dead?" "I would think wrong place, wrong time.
He simply had the misfortune to bump into something nasty in the night.
Joseph's eyes narrowed. None of Billy's other victims had done anything wrong either.
Maybe. The family's been informed and there's a liaison officer with them. Dave was in early, so he went straight over. We'll talk to them later.
Nikki looked at him pensively.
And Joseph, I suggest we keep everything that we discussed last night just between us for the time being, and you need to try to keep your emotions under tight control, even if you see this man again.
She shook her head.
Otherwise, everything will have to come out in the open, and I don't want you to have to face all that, not officially, unless there is absolutely no other way.
Joseph nodded.
If we catch him, it will be a different ballgame, but until then I'll do my best to keep a lid on my reactions.
He gave her a relieved smile.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
No problem. Now grab a pile of these reports and help me check them, and a very strong coffee may help.
She held out a sheaf of paperwork. Joseph took them and grinned.
Can you believe that brandy?
I can't believe we drank half a bottle of the stuff, that's for sure. She grimaced. Or maybe I can.
She flopped into a chair and looked up at him with a pained expression.
You didn't actually go swimming earlier, did you?
Yep.
He felt a thrill run through him as he recalled those soft lips touch his cheek.
And I'm glad I did.
Ah, Bryony.
Joseph smiled and nodded, although he wondered if he had imagined a slight hint of disapproval.
Then just keep your wits about you, Sergeant. Don't get too distracted.
Her old tone was back, so he just grinned and went to get the coffee. As he placed the cups under the dispenser and waited, he glanced through the reports. Nothing leapt out, other than a memo from the Soko, who had checked Knott Cottage. He returned to the murder room and put the drinks on the desk.
You were right about whoever turned over Martin Durham's drum. The Soko says it was a pro.
I said he was.
His boss frowned angrily.
Your average blagger would never have disabled me that easily.
She scanned the memo and made a snorting noise.
No trace evidence found at scene. No fingerprints, footprints, stray hairs, no bloody nothing.
Are we surprised?
No, not at all. I just half hoped that we wouldn't have to wait for the DNA on that hair that I managed to yank from his scalp.
Makes it even more important that you did.
I suppose. I just wish things happened as fast as they do in CSI or NCIS.
I don't think the Fenland Constabulary's budget could run to a dedicated state-of-the-art forensic labs like Abbey Shuto's. We are lucky to have cars, even if half of them are clapped out. Sadly, this is the real world.
And it's a psych ward run by the inmates.
Nikki threw up her hands.
We've got this fabulous building, cost a fortune, and we have to sign in triplicate and wait for 3 weeks if we need a new stapler.
With a disgusted grunt, she picked up the telephone that had shrieked out from the desk in front of her.
Yes, dear Galena here. Oh, hello, Rory.
She listened for a moment, then holding the receiver between her chin and her shoulder, began sorting through the remaining reports.
Got it? Yes, hang on.
She opened the thin envelope and began to read.
After a second or two, she said, But I don't understand.
Joseph looked at her. Her voice had dropped to little more than a sigh.
That seems impossible, Professor.
After a while, she thanked him and hung up. The tox report on Martin. His bloodstream was flowing with doxapin hydrochloride, in the form of a drug called sinapin. The professor thought he should draw my attention to it prior to delivering his full opinion.
Joseph frowned. I don't remember seeing any drugs of that name at Knott Cottage.
There weren't any. I have a list of all the medication that he was legitimately taking, and all bar one were present in the report. And Rory is very concerned.
What kind of drug is this sinapin?
He asked.
No idea. The professor is bringing his preliminary findings over at lunchtime, and he'll give us the details then.
Nikki picked up her coffee cup and stared into it.
They couldn't have been recreational. Martin never took drugs. Hell, I've spent half my life with drug users. I'd have spotted signs.
They sound like prescription drugs, said Joseph. So how did he get hold of them?
The boss shrugged. This is getting more shitty by the hour.
She looked worried.
Then we should be getting our heads around Chris Forbes' murder.
I've been thinking about that. The type of rope that was used may be of help to us.
He sucked in air, then lowered his voice so that only she could hear him.
Soldiers always have string or twine in their kit. I'll be interested to hear what kind it is.
The boss said nothing, but just nodded.
And the knots the killer used. I should have been more attentive, but the shock of seeing the body in that position, I just had to get out of there.
Don't be too hard on yourself, Joseph. It's hardly surprising, is it? There was compassion in her voice. But if you can, check the photographs as soon as we have them. I'm sure the report will pick up on the way the victim was bound. I'll certainly be able to tell you if it was a military-style attack. Let's just wait and see, shall we? Part of me is still hoping that this has nothing to do with you. The boss gave him an unenthusiastic look, although the other part is pretty sure that's not the case. She closed her file with a snap. But let's not jump the gun. Hard evidence is what we require. Joseph nodded, then looked up as the door opened and Dave Harris walked in. His face was drawn, and his eyes deep and sad. That's one side of police work that I hate. Don't we all? Said Nikki. So, anything helpful from the parents? Dave sat down heavily and shook his head. All but useless, Gov. Chris Forbes lived at home. He was 34, but he was not bright, if you catch my drift. Learning difficulties? Asked Joseph. Dave nodded. Not severe, but his younger brother said that the lift never went up to the top floor. Chris was happy in his own little fantasy world, and sadly, the family were happy to let him live there. Something they're no doubt regretting, murmured Nikki. He didn't work and spent most of his time in pool halls with his drop-out mates. To be honest, I don't think he was bad, just highly impressionable and very trusting. And no one took him too seriously, I suppose. That's the point, Sarge. Who listens for long to a Walter Mitty? His brothers admitted that he'd been going on about some brilliant bloke who bought him drinks, but as none of them had actually met him, and as they didn't give a toss who Chris was drinking with, we have no description. Where did he drink? Or play pool? Maybe we can track this new friend that way, said Nikki. The Plough on River Street was his local, Gov. Kat's checked it out already. He was there with a stranger recently, but no one took any notice of him. The description was hazy, just kind of ordinary, nondescript, and he always wore a knitted beanie hat. Dave pulled a face. The only thing that did come up was that Chris called his new friend by a nickname. And that was? He called him Snaz, Mum. Joseph fought to stifle an involuntary gasp, and when he glanced up, he saw Nikki staring at him. Well, that's a start, Dave. Go grab yourself some breakfast, okay? As the door closed, she raised her eyebrows inquiringly. Right, Joseph. What spooked you? Fighting to keep his voice level, he said, The Russian Special Forces soldiers are called Spetsnaz, Mom. Billy Sweet held them in pretty high regard, and he always referred to them as the Snaz. He looked at her inquiringly. Now where do you sit on the subject of coincidences? An hour later, Kat knocked lightly on Nikki's door and stuck her head around. Got a minute, Mum? Only if you've got me something on Chris Forbes' friend Snaz. I went back to the Plough, Mum, to see one of Chris's old friends. This bloke Liam mentioned seeing Chris with a stranger outside a dodgy pool parlour down by the docks, a dirty dive called the Paper Wall. Want me to check it out, Mum? Asked Joseph. No offence, Sergeant, but I think we'll leave it to Kat. She has a knack of blending in rather well in dubious joints, don't you, Detective? She smiled at Joseph. Sorry, but she'll get more than you from their kind of clientele. You look a tad too wholesome for the Paper Wall. You make it sound as if I should be selling war cry, said Joseph huffily. If the cap fits, mate, laughed Kat. You leave this one to me. I have a rare talent for disguise when undercover. I know. I've seen you in action, remember? Joseph closed the report he'd been reading. So what am I trying to find out while I'm stamping on the cockroaches? If anyone can give us an ID on the man with the tag Snaz. You do know they won't have CCTV, and their security consists of an 18-stone tattooed woman who looks harder than Desperate Dan? You mean Gloria? Nikki smiled. Yeah, start with her. As long as she wasn't already juiced up by the time Chris and his new friend got there, she would have clocked them all right. Get round there as soon as they open, okay? Can't wait. Well, if that's the case, why don't you rope in Yvonne and Niall and go around all the local pool halls and pubs to try to find someone who can finger this mystery man that Chris has been spending time with? We need a face, Kat. No problem, Mum. Kat gathered up her jacket and headed for the door. Time for a swift change of clothes, and then show us committed. Nikki glanced up at the clock. Professor Wilkinson should be with them shortly with the preliminary report on Martin's death, and it was a report that was worrying the life out of her. Strangely, even the execution of Chris Forbes couldn't rid her of the constant nagging anxiety about her old neighbour and his horrible death.
"More coffee, Mom?" asked Joseph.
"Make that 3. Rory has his black, no sugar."
A few moments later, Rory Wilkinson stuck his head round the door and waved a large white paper bag.
"I come bearing gifts, and I don't mean gruesome goodies from the Path Lab either."
No matter how grim her thoughts had been, this unorthodox forensic genius always managed to bring a smile to her face.
"Then welcome, Professor. Grab a seat. Joseph is already getting refreshments, which should go nicely with these."
He tore open the bag and revealed 3 enormous chocolate eclairs.
"Called in at the boulangerie en route. C'est magnifique, n'est-ce pas?"
"Oh, Lord, I should say so. If Joseph doesn't get a move on, he'll be unlucky."
As if on cue, Joseph shouldered the door open and entered carrying 3 large mugs of coffee.
"Haven't missed anything, have I?"
"Nearly, but not quite,"
said Nikki, looking longingly at the thick chocolate covering the cream-filled choux pastry.
"Right, so are these to help sweeten the mood? Known about your other gift, the one in the giant brown manila folder." "Ah, so astute. Every inch the detective, Mom." He grinned. "But no, actually, I missed breakfast and I'm starving."
His face became a little more serious.
"Although I have to say, the tidings that I bring are by no means straightforward."
"As if I thought there would be," sighed Nikki, taking a bite out of her eclair. "So, whenever you are ready."
The pathologist put down his coffee mug, dabbed at the corners of his mouth with a white handkerchief, and sat back.
"Well, Mr. Durham died as a result of his fall from the church tower. This we know. His injuries were a little different to those normally expected from a fall from such a great height, because of the fact that he hit the wall and not a flat, hard surface. He had shattered his spinal column at the areas of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th lumbar vertebrae, severing the spinal cord and shearing through the arteries."
Rory pointed to the folder.
"There's much more, of course, it's all in there. Crushed ribs, massive head injury, and intracranial bleeds, caused as his head was swung down against the wall when his back broke. Liver damaged et al., but this is to be expected, wholly understandable, and it's none of this that worries me."
Nikki was feeling a mild nausea sweep over her. This was an old friend that Rory was describing, and it didn't make pleasant listening. She tried not to think of broken, splintered bones and quickly said,
"It's a toxicology report, isn't it?"
Rory nibbled delicately on his eclair and nodded.
Exactly."
He removed a thick batch of papers from his file, skimmed through them, and laid them on the desk and looked up.
"I'll try to simplify this for you, and please don't think that I'm insulting your intelligence, dear hearts. But forensic toxicology is complex, and it's still one of the most difficult tasks to prove death by poisoning."
"He was poisoned?" asked Joseph, almost choking on his coffee.
No, well, not in the way that you mean, but there again, one could say that."
"Rory," Nikki bit her lip, "come to the point."
"Sorry. What I mean is this. Martin Durham killed himself by leaping from the tower. Fact. He did this because he was under the effect of a powerful hallucinogen. Fact. But did he purposefully take the drug himself, or was it administered to him by person or persons unknown? Unproven."
"Tell us about the drugs," said Joseph. He had a real cache of them at his home.
"And thereby hangs another mystery," replied Rory. "But let's take this step at a time, shall we? We took samples from his blood, urine, stomach contents, liver, what was left of it, and his vitreous humour. You see, you are not just looking for the toxins, you are looking for their effects in the form of metabolites. So, using a combination of mass spectrometry and gas spectrometry, we isolated and identified samples of all his prescription drugs, bar one. Plus another substance, the one that turned out to be doxepin hydrochloride."
Nikki stared across the desk at Rory.
"You just said, bar one. Why would he take all his meds and leave one out? Is it something that he didn't need to take regularly?"
"Oh, no, it's part of his daily regime."
"And the other one, the hallucinogen, what would that be taken for?"
It's used quite legitimately as an anti-anxiety drug, an antidepressant. It's similar to amitriptyline, but, as with a lot of chemicals, it's not the drug itself, it's the quantity that is taken. And this was a dose large enough to trigger an acid trip in an elephant. But Martin never used recreational drugs. He didn't smoke and he didn't drink. Then that could have made its effect on him even more severe. Joseph placed his mug on the desk and stared at it. There were no pharmaceutical company boxes or bottles in Martin's home that were antidepressants, of that I am sure. And as his GP never mentioned them, how did he get hold of them? And why take it anyway? By accident? That's possible, of course, said Rory, but frankly, I doubt it. It's the missing tablet that has me foxed. He pushed his glasses further up onto the bridge of his nose and peered at Nikki. From what I understand, Martin Durham was a meticulous man and very careful with his medication. You knew him, so am I right? Bear in mind, I never knew he took medication, but otherwise, most certainly. His house was spotless. He cooked wholesome food and exercised regularly. I deduce that much from the state of his body and the contents of his stomach. He puffed out his cheeks and made a low whistling sound. So, why miss one tablet? Anyone who takes pills regularly has a specific routine, and if those tablets are life-sustaining, you are very particular indeed. Common sense would dictate that somehow he took the Sinapin accidentally, believing it to be his other tablet, said Joseph thoughtfully. Do they look alike, Professor? Not at all. The antidepressant is a brightly coloured gelatin capsule, the colour varying as to the strength of the dose, and his own drug was a small yellow tablet. No way would he have confused them. Then he was deliberately given it. By someone else, muttered Nikki. Maybe the man who ransacked his cottage. This is ludicrous, exclaimed Joseph. We're talking about an ordinary man, someone who lives in a small village in a time-warp cottage, with a love for the marshes and not a scrap of scandal to his name. Why on earth should he be targeted, maybe even killed, by some shady professional hitman? It just doesn't make sense. We need to find out more about Martin's past, said Nikki flatly. How much do we really know about the people around us? Not much, I'm willing to wager. Rory nodded. For what it's worth, I really think that's where you should start. If he were given that drug intentionally, then you have to find out who is behind it. This time, just one man died, but he could have taken any one of those poor souls up on the viewing platform with him. And there were children there, weren't there? Nikki nodded dumbly. She knew a bit about hallucinations. She'd seen enough junkies on bad trips, kids whose senses were telling them lies, making them believe all manner of nightmares. A string of questions flooded into her mind. What on earth had Martin become involved in? What could be so awful that he should be sent to such a terrible death? Or was she just being paranoid? There were most likely other far more common or garden reasons for what happened, and maybe the break-in was just that, and the intruder really did just land her with a lucky punch. Maybe. And then there is my other little mystery regarding his medication. Rory adjusted his glasses again. I did a little ferreting of my own because I was puzzled to see that most of his tablets were issued by Dr. Latimer of Cloud Fen, and 2 others came in plain white boxes with the tablet name and dosage on the side, but no maker's name. They most certainly did not come from any of the suppliers that I know. Internet? Inquired Joseph. Isn't that where people self-medicate themselves these days? Aha! 2 minds. But no, dear Joseph. Sadly, my mini-investigation has proved us wrong. I've no idea where these drugs come from. Nikki looked towards Joseph. Time for you to take another trip to Dr. Latimer's surgery, I think. The pathologist smiled. I have my doubts that she will know any more than we do, but I'd be interested to see her expression when you tell her about this little conundrum. And I have to leave this with you now. Rory pushed the file across the desk to her. Don't read it after dark. He took another, thinner file from his bag. Now, we come to the unfortunate Mr. Christopher Forbes, and this is much more straightforward. A deliberate and ruthless murder, carried out with minimum fuss and scarily, skillfully, executed. A professional? Asked Nikki before Joseph could speak. Most definitely. Knew exactly the right amount of pressure to use, and the correct angle of the blade for a clean and fatal cut. A contract killer, then? Rory took a deep breath. I'd say this man had more of a military background. Hitmen prefer guns. It's impersonal. A gun distances the killer from the victim. You have to be very sure of yourself and very cool to use a knife. Not many people have the nerve to get that up close with their prey.
Nikki looked at Joseph, but his face was set in stone. She knew he'd just had the confirmation he'd been waiting for.
There was very little trace evidence on the body. Probably nothing after we've eliminated the few odd hairs on his clothing. Frankly, I'm not expecting much at all.
Rory stretched.
The only thing that we have with a connection to the murderer is the rope that he used to tie the man. And sadly, it's pretty common stuff. The kind you can pick up in any marine chandler's or outdoor pursuit store.
Nikki heard Joseph murmur the word damn under his breath.
So, apart from a positive gallery of photographs, that is all I have for you at present. And I do need to get back, so it's over to you, my friends.
Rory stood up.
And do let me know what you discover about that mysterious missing pill. It's a sort of a cursed thing that bugs your every waking moment and then robs you of your sleep.
Isn't it just? Said Nikki vehemently. But I'll get to the bottom of it, Professor. I promise you that.
Oh, I'm sure you will, Inspector dearest. Just don't take too long. I shall be positively haggard with worry, and you've no idea just how much I value my beauty sleep.
With a curt bow and a flourish of his hand, he was gone, and Nikki and Joseph were left in the silent office. Rory's exit had taken with it every ounce of humour and life from the room. Suddenly, Joseph stood up.
I should go and see Dr. Latimer.
Nikki frowned at him.
In a moment, but don't you have anything to say about Chris Forbes' death?
What's to say, Mom?
He was killed by a military-trained operative. I knew that. We'll find him, Joseph. Someone at the paper wall will give us an ID. Then we can look for him in earnest.
I can give you an ID, Mom, but if he doesn't want us to find him, we won't find him.
End of. This isn't the jungle, Sergeant. It's a market town in the Fens. You can't sneeze here without half the town offering you a hanky. She looked at him long and hard. And we still have no absolute proof that it is Billy Sweet. This could be some nasty scam. Have you considered that there may be someone out there who wants to get at you for putting their nearest and dearest in the scrubs, or somewhere equally as salubrious? An old case. Someone has decided it's payback time. It does happen, Joseph. Joseph didn't answer, but just stared down at his feet. We have to be objective, you know that. Nikki reasoned. It's like Martin's death. I knew him, and my gut tells me that someone engineered his demise deliberately, but I have to consider that it may have just been a terrible accident. Maybe some half-brain in the Wild Goose thought he looked a bit down and stuck a little helper in his orange juice. Who knows? Maybe something went wrong in the pharmaceutical factory. Perhaps a rogue tablet got mixed in with others, and he'd taken it before he realised. I don't want to, Joseph, but I have to look down all the avenues.
I guess you're right.
His voice was low and almost husky.
I'm sorry, Mom, but it's hard to think about any other scenario when it all seems so clear, so vividly clear.
I know. Nikki did know, but right now it wasn't helping. Look, maybe you should concentrate on Martin for a bit, and I head up the hunt for our assassin. I don't mean permanently, just until we've gathered a bit more information. Keep each other up to date with everything, and back each other up as and when required. How does that sound?
Sure.
He gave her a weak smile.
Maybe it's for the best.
Okay, so bugger off to dear Helen Latimer, and the best of the British.
What is it with you two?
Asked Joseph, a hint of his usual humour creeping back into his voice. Old history, Joseph. Very old history. Probably neither of us can honestly remember why we finished up as such eye-gouging adversaries, but... She gave a little laugh. We're so used to bitching about each other that it comes as second nature. Joseph looked at her shrewdly.
I'm willing to bet the good doctor knows exactly why you two don't get on. Maybe I should ask her about it.
Do that, sonny boy, and you'll be back in Fenchester before you can blink.
Ah.
His grin widened.
Caught you there. But when these two cases are over, I want to know all the sordid gossip. Okay? Sort this mess, and I'll be glad to sit down with the rest of that brandy and bare my very soul, sordid bits and all. Now sod off, Sergeant, and find me some answers, some I can believe in.
Chapter 14. As Joseph drove towards Cloud Fen, Nikki delivered a diluted version of her report to the superintendent. She had decided not to dwell on the suggestion that Martin Durham may have met with his maker by design. It would not take much for Rick Bainbridge to remove her from the case, and any suggestion by her of foul play could be misconstrued as being emotionally too close. So as far as she could, she concentrated on the death of Chris Forbes.
Sir, we have a well-liked, although highly impressionable man, not retarded, but certainly not the brightest light on the Christmas tree, murdered by a trained killer, and we have unearthed nothing so far to indicate a motive for the killing.
The super thought about it for a moment, then said,
Well, it seems that he frequented public houses and pool halls. Maybe he overheard something he shouldn't, and the killer didn't trust him not to shoot his mouth off.
Possibly, sir. We'll know more when we get an ID on this man who has been hanging around with him. If the mystery man was the murderer, then it sounds as if Chris was being groomed, although for what, I can't imagine.
A clinical killing like this is very rare, Nikki. It's the sort of thing you hear about in war zones, not Greenborough.
His face screwed up into a leathery mask of concern.
As a matter of interest, what did Joseph make of it?
Nikki used one of Joseph's own blank expressions, and said,
Much the same as you, sir. Why?
Just wondered.
Joseph's past was not common knowledge, and although the superintendent knew about his background, he was unaware that Nikki also knew, and right now she wanted it to stay that way.
And where are we with your suicide case, Martin Durham? Continued the super.
There is some concern over the drugs in his system brought up by the tox report. Joseph has driven out to speak to his GP about it, and nothing's shown up from the break-in at Knott Cottage.
Oh well, keep me up to speed on that.
He sighed and shook his head.
And thinking about suicides, all this has rather put paid to the work that you were doing for me, hasn't it? The statistics on unnatural deaths.
His face darkened.
You wouldn't believe it. We have an execution-style murder on our patch, and still I'm being asked for bloody useless figures and sodden reports. It's crazy.
We've not given up on it, sir. We'll do our best to get something together for you.
Nikki suddenly felt sorry for him. Rick had been a great copper, but slowly he had come to hate everything that promotion had brought with it. There were times when she knew that he would rather be back on the beat than organising flowcharts and initiatives and juggling budgets.
Don't worry, sir. Joseph is a wizard with figures. If there is an anomaly there, I'm sure he'll spot it.
The murder comes first, Nikki, I know that, but if you can sneak an hour or two on them sometime, I'd be grateful.
Nikki left his office and wandered down to the canteen in search of a snack and a hot drink. Her head was a mess. Joseph was worrying her senseless, and she had no one to talk to about it. She took her lunch back to her office and half-heartedly unwrapped an unappetizing-looking sandwich. Unless there was something that Joseph wasn't telling her about this Billy Sweet, she could not fathom why some psycho should suddenly leap back from the past and start stalking him. She chewed slowly and wondered if she should try to get some kind of trace on Sweet. Not that she had a clue where to begin. Joseph had mentioned that he had gone to work for a private security force, which sounded very much like the man was now a mercenary soldier, and that meant his movements would be very hard to track. Probably impossible. She sipped her drink. She really didn't believe that Joseph had held anything back. He honestly seemed as confused about what was happening as she did. And if he was right, and it was Sweet, why kill a vulnerable man like Chris Forbes? She picked up a pen, scribbled answers on pieces of paper.
1. The super's idea. CF was silenced for knowing something. 2. The killer's a psycho, he doesn't need a reason. 3. Practice. CF was not his primary target. 4. Mistaken identity. 5. CF could have been anyone. He was killed purely to get Joseph's attention.
Nikki ringed number 5, then added, to freak Joseph out. She underlined it in heavy strokes. No matter how much she hated the thought, Joseph did seem to be the key. And if that were the case, how much longer could she keep this under wraps? She finished her mouthful, threw the rest in the bin, and stood up. She needed a recognizable face to that new friend of Chris Forbes, and she needed it before the shit hit the fan for Joseph. Joseph pulled the Ford off the main road and headed back on himself along a narrow lane that led to a small wetlands nature reserve. He knew that he should be getting back to the station, but he felt overwhelmed by the sudden need to get away from the furore of the murder inquiry. He wanted a few minutes alone, to think. And as he had driven away from Cloud Fen, he remembered what Nikki Galena had once told him about going to the sea bank to get her head together. After half a mile, he pulled into a sheltered parking area almost completely surrounded by trees and bushes. A weather-beaten painted sign told him that parking was free, although cars were left at the owner's risk. Too right, he thought. Secluded and miles from anywhere, the perfect spot for a bit of vehicle vandalism. He locked his car and offered a small prayer that it would remain as he left it, complete with CD player and hopefully all its wheels, then followed the path through the trees and up to the high riverbank. To his left were the lagoons, shallow, watery pools frequented by waterfowl and waders, and to his right the riverbank ran for miles out into the marshes, and finally onto the estuary. It wasn't Nikki's famous sea bank, but it was the next best thing. He looked both ways, then chose the lagoons, and seeing no one else around, wandered along the track to one of the dilapidated bird hides. The steps up were rickety, and the door was little better. It swung open with a creak loud enough to scare every bird on the east coast. Inside there was a weird smell of salt-damp wood and a mustiness that was less than pleasant. He opened the observation flap, hooked it up, and sat on the wooden bench to look out. At first he saw only sedge-grass, reeds, and the oily dark waters of the lagoons, but after a while he realized that there was movement all around him. Tiny warblers clung to the reeds, their harsh, repetitive song echoing across the pools. A heron stood seemingly motionless in the shallow water, and above him a skylark's song rose and fell continuously. He knew he didn't have long, but this was what he needed right now, a place of solitude, somewhere to put his thoughts in order. He took a deep breath, held it, then allowed his mind to go over what had just occurred at the Cloud Fen surgery. Predictably, Dr. Latimer had been furious. She had never prescribed any form of antidepressants for Martin Durham and flatly denied any knowledge of the other 2 types of tablets that he had been taking. She had stared at the photo of the plain white boxes in complete amazement and demanded to know where he had got them from. She had then proceeded to blame Joseph and his team for not comparing Martin's medical notes with the drugs they had found at the house. It had taken a while to placate her, and even then, Joseph had finally left, feeling ill at ease. Either Martin had been seeing 2 doctors, or he had been obtaining drugs illegally, and that just didn't gel with the kind of person that his sister and the DI had described. He had made a mental note to ring the oncology clinic that conducted Martin's yearly follow-up. Maybe they could throw some light on his mixture of medication. He stretched his aching back and watched as a curlew probed its long, down-curved beak into the edge of the water, searching for food. And Martin Durham was not the only problem. There was the other matter, the one he could hardly bear to think about, the fact that poor, trusting Chris Forbes might have died because of him. He chewed on a rough nail and tried to relax the turmoil in his head. He cursed softly. It really wasn't fair. Until the moment when he had seen that horrible face peering through his windscreen, things had been good, really good. He had come to terms with himself, accepted that he couldn't change the horrors of his past, but that he must not let them ruin the present or his future. He had let the bitterness of his divorce go, and made inroads to some kind of peace with his daughter. He had taken a new job with a boss that he had learnt to respect, and he'd survived an attack. Yes, things were good, until Billy Sweet's ugly face had appeared and tainted everything. Joseph looked down and saw deep indentations in the palms of his hands. He had clenched his fists so tight that his nails had almost broken the skin. How could things swing around so quickly? How? His mobile broke the silence, and for a second made his heart race. He flipped it open expecting to see the governor's name, but to his surprise, it was Bryony. He stared at it, but didn't answer it. Apart from his job, she was the only happy thing in his life at present, and he was scared to get involved with her. If Sweet was after him, there would be no better way to get to him than through a girlfriend. So for her sake, he should keep his distance. The tinny ringtone seemed to go on forever, but finally it stopped, and the quiet in the small hut became almost deafening. Sweet was even souring his hopes and dreams. He pushed the phone back into his pocket, then closed down the hatch. He should get back. Remarkably, the car was still there, and in one piece. "Thank you," he murmured to his unseen angels, and unlocked it. As he did, he heard his phone bleep, telling him that he had a text message. "I'm having a seriously shitty day. A drink would help. Would your big case allow it? Ring me. Bry." Joseph stared at the message, his finger hovering over the reply button. If he didn't contact her, she wouldn't wait forever. And what if he was wrong about everything? Maybe some villain from his past had decided to set him up for a fall. It would appear that he was still pretty shaky after his recent trauma, so perhaps he was letting his imagination get things out of proportion. By letting Bryony go, he could be ruining a chance for some happiness in his life. He stared at his mobile phone and felt like Don Camillo talking to JC, weighing up his worldly options against his moral conscience. With a sigh, he closed his phone and pushed his key into the ignition. JC wins. The risk was too great. The murder room was now alive with CID officers. A series of photographs, dates, times, places, and names were spread over the big glass caseboard. Most of it he could handle easily, but the picture of Chris Forbes' clinical assassination made him shudder every time he looked at it. Dave Harris acknowledged him with a wave. "Anything new, Dave?" he asked, sliding behind his desk. "Not yet, Sarge. Kat's just rung me and said they were having no luck at all. Reckon she'd never heard the words average, nondescript, and ordinary used so often. And I suppose he always wore a hat or a hoodie." "Exactly, making it almost impossible to give a description." "Is the boss in, Dave?" "Fuming quietly in her office. I think she'd hoped that we would have been able to circulate at least an e-fit by now." He pulled a face. "I hope you've got some good news for her if you're planning on going in there unarmed." "Thankfully, I've got a few phone calls to make first." He logged into his computer and searched the file on Martin Durham until he found the name of the oncology clinic that he had attended. He scribbled down the number and lifted the phone. "Oncology Suite, good afternoon. How may I help you?" The voice sounded too young to be anything other than a brownie, but he explained who he was and asked to be put through to whoever was in charge. After a while, he was passed on to a fully-fledged girl guide. He swiftly explained the situation, then gave her the police station number and asked her to ring them direct to confirm his authenticity. It took only 5 minutes for his desk phone to ring. "I'd be glad to assist Detective Sergeant Easter, but I'm afraid we do not have a patient of that name." "But I have copies of reports sent to a Dr. Helen Latimer in Cloud Fen. Now I can understand that you would prefer not to discuss this over the phone, but—" "Sorry, Sergeant, it's not that. I've checked our database thoroughly. We have never treated anyone of that name, and before you ask, I have cross-checked the spelling." Joseph thanked her and slowly replaced the phone. What had Helen Latimer said to him when he first spoke to her? "I've had regular updates from his oncology clinic." With a frown, he picked the phone back up and dialed the doctor's number. "Yes, it is important." His tone held no room for negotiation, and soon he heard Dr. Latimer's voice. The woman was clearly unhappy at having her work interrupted. "Sorry, but this is urgent," he snapped. "I need to know if you ever recall ringing Martin Durham's oncology clinic personally." The woman went silent for a while, then, in a considerably softer voice, said, "Now you come to mention it, there was never any need to. They always contacted me either by phone or by mail." She paused. "What's this all about, Sergeant Easter?" "I wish I knew, Doctor. Really, I do." He thanked her and hung up. Bad mood or not, it was time to see the DI. "Never heard of him. There has to be some mistake." The administrator was adamant. "I think we really need to find out a lot more about your neighbor, don't you?" said Joseph. Nikki felt the muscles in her neck tense. It seemed as if her fears about Martin were about to be realized. For a while she said nothing, as thoughts madly careered about her head. Then she looked down at the heap of paperwork on her desk. "This isn't going to help either." She tapped her finger on the files. "The sudden death statistics that we were working on." She gave Joseph a wry smile. "It's all right, I'm not scabbing off the murder investigation. It's just that the super is still being hounded for bloody figures, and I needed something to occupy my mind while I was waiting for Kat and her crew to get back." She sorted out 2 reports and handed them across to Joseph. "I was getting them into some form of order, and I saw a name I recognized. When I looked further, I started to feel twitchy. Look at these and tell me what you think." She sat back and observed him while he studied the papers. This was not the Joseph who had first come to Greenborough. That man had been calm, quietly sure of himself, and completely in control. The Joseph who sat opposite her now looked drawn and preoccupied. He seemed as if his mind was in constant debate over something, and if she didn't know him better, she would have said he was frightened. After a while he looked up. "I see what you mean, Mom, but 2 other cases of suicide and very stable, apparently happy people doesn't mean much, does it?" Nikki shrugged. "These are just basic summaries, no autopsies or any other reports. I think we should check them out. Both caused something of a stir at the time, I do remember that." She rubbed her eyes. "I'd hate to think we missed something, and that bad things were happening to good people." She took the paper from him, stared at it, then dredged what she could remember from her memory. Amelia Reed, age 51. Bit of a local hero in as much as she rescued and cared for stray and ill-treated animals. She drowned in her bath. No history of mental illness. There were questions as to whether it was suicide or accidental death. There were some other questions too, but I can't recall what they were. I do know an open verdict was returned." Joseph nodded thoughtfully. "And the other one?" "Paul Cousins, age 52, seen running towards the railway lines as if all the hounds of hell were pursuing him, only it wasn't hounds that caught up with him. It was a 9:45 from Peterborough. The day before, he'd become a grandfather for the first time." "Running as if pursued," said Joseph thoughtfully. "Surely that's a similar scenario to Martin. And are these recent cases?" "Within the last 12 months. Maybe I should get someone to pull the full reports, just in case there are any more factors that could connect them." Joseph rubbed hard on his chin. "Although, frankly, I think we may be wasting precious time." "Maybe, but this still has to be done." She jabbed her finger at the statistics. "I have no intentions of leaving the super in the brown and sticky stuff." Nikki exhaled loudly. "And I know we have a violent killer out there, and he has to be caught. But there is something very wrong with Martin's death too, and if someone is inducing innocent people to kill themselves, then this other assassin is just as bad and equally as deadly." "Maybe we should hand it over to another team," said Joseph dubiously. "In which case would you hand over, Joseph?" Nikki looked at him steadily. "One seems to be connected to you, and the other to me." Joseph looked directly into her eyes, but did not answer. "Not easy, is it? And although no way would I expect you to explain everything about your past to another team, I feel that I owe Martin to find out who did this to him." She abruptly stood up and began to pace the office. "You see, I think I may have done him a disservice, unintentionally, that is." "Maybe I shouldn't ask this." Joseph turned his head slightly to one side, "and I know he was practically old enough to be your father, but was there more to your relationship than just being neighbours?" A while ago, Nikki would have thought nothing of throwing him out of the office, but now she just shook her head and handed him the photo of Martin, Hannah, and herself. "No, never, but I think maybe I missed the signs." He stared at the picture. "That he cared for you." I think I was so wrapped up in my own life, my own problems, that I never saw it. That, and, as you so delicately mentioned, he was such a lot older than me, I never even considered the possibility." "Are you basing that supposition purely on this?" Joseph passed the photo back. "No, there's something else." She drew in a long breath and stared at the picture. "You know how long my daughter's been in hospital, don't you? Well, someone has been sending her a small bunch of freesias, same day, every week, without fail. This is the first time for over a year, when there have been no flowers." "And you think Martin sent them?" "Who else? It certainly wasn't her father," she said bitterly. "That bastard visited once, then rang me and said it was all too traumatic and flew back to the States. We haven't seen him since." "You've tried to find out who sent them?" "Oh, yes, but they used a town florist and paid cash, via an envelope through the door. No name, and no card attached." "It's certainly odd, but it sounds like something that will never be explained." "Probably not. I certainly can't ask him now, can I?" "So what do we do about the 2 investigations?" "We juggle them. The super has provided a lot of backup to help with Chris Forbes' murder inquiry, so I suggest you and I delegate as much of the legwork that we possibly can, and meantime, we keep digging up all we can about Martin and these other suspect suicides. And we need to see Martin's sister again. I'm damn sure she knows something that she wasn't prepared to tell us last time." Joseph nodded, and Nikki could see a flicker of relief in his eyes. Not that she believed it would last for long. Even if their killer was not sweet, he seemed to be doing a good job in remaining unidentified, which kept Joseph in a permanent state of agitation, and that helped no one. If it helps, I'll stay on tonight and try to crunch some numbers for the super. Before all this blew up, I'd thought of a way to get a better overall view across forces, see what criteria they use and how they arrive at their figures. Nikki hated to say yes when Joseph looked so exhausted, but she had the feeling that he couldn't rest even if he did go home. There was far too much on his mind. If you could, just a couple of hours would be great. She flopped back down in her chair. I'll stay too, and I'll send out for a Chinese if you like. Suits me, Mom. Mrs. Blakely has threatened a corned beef hash tonight, and I'm not too sure I could stomach it. Doesn't sound quite your thing, Joseph. He threw her a small smile. Oh, I'm fine with hash generally, but I happened to see the sell-by date on the tin of corned beef. That's what's worrying me. Ah, right. Chinese it is, then. Chapter 15. Cat Cullen and the others arrived back just after 6. There was little to report, and nothing that would help their identification of Snaz. I can't believe how sodding thick some people are, she grumbled. No one could give us hair colour, no distinguishing marks or tattoos, no label wear or designer clothing, and no name, other than some of them heard Chris called him Snaz. And since the murder, he has conveniently disappeared, added Niall, unbuckling his heavy equipment belt. Nikki remained impassive. She had expected little else. Okay, well, you guys get home, grab some sleep and be back early. She looked across at the big figure of Dave Harris, who still sat hunched over his computer, doggedly thumping on the keyboard. And that includes you, Dave. Right you are, Mum. I'm pretty well finished here. He double-clicked the mouse, and a printer whirred into life. Everything I can find on Amelia Reed and Paul Cousins. He raised his eyebrows, and there's quite a bit. Nikki took the information from him and went to her office. She had already tried to get hold of Elizabeth Durham and been greeted by an answer phone. She had left a message asking her to get in touch as a matter of some urgency. Now, as Joseph was flicking through reams of figures on the computer screen, there was little left for her to do but to tackle Dave's reports. She sat back and began to thumb through them. Dave had been his usual thorough self and even printed off local newspaper articles on the deaths. As she began to read, the stories flooded back to her. 2 deaths that had shocked their nearest and dearest to the core. Paul Cousins' horrific method of dying had left several pasty-faced officers searching the railway line for missing internal organs, and his wife requiring long-term psychiatric treatment. Like Martin, he had no money worries, but Paul was surrounded by a close family, and the coming of the first grandchild had apparently been a total joy. Nikki skimmed down the press cuttings, and words like disbelief, impossible, and bombshell kept reoccurring. The same words that she could use in relation to Martin. There were similar descriptions regarding Amelia Reed, although the circumstances regarding her death were far more obscure. Did she black out? Was she held under? Or did she drown herself? Every aspect was hacked around for weeks in the papers. As a woman, she seemed full of fire and had a real passion for helping animals. She was someone who had been known to take on gangs of badger baiters and, on one occasion, before the fox hunting ban, a full complement of scarlet-coated huntsmen. She had climbed over walls, fences, and barbed wire to rescue ill-treated dogs and various forms of livestock, and was thanked by receiving several broken bones and a criminal record. Not exactly a scaredy cat, were you, Amelia? Thought Nikki. She turned to another account, read it, then frowned and read it again. A neighbour had reported hearing Amelia remonstrate loudly with someone about an hour before she died, but on investigation there was no indication of anyone else ever being in the house. This was backed up by the fact that one of her dogs, a faithful and possessive Jack Russell, never barked at all during what had seemed like a heated argument. Nikki quickly checked against the police statements and found the name of the neighbour. She ran her finger down the details and stopped at the telephone number. This had happened a year ago, but there was a good chance that the person still lived there. She picked up the phone and dialed. Mr. Matthews? Excellent. Now, I'm sorry to ring like this, but I was wondering... Nikki explained that they were reviewing the case and needed his help. They talked for a while, then she thanked him and hung up. She could be wrong, but her gut feeling said otherwise. She grabbed the rest of the notes and hunted through for the PM results. Damn! She swore out loud, then she went over it again. There was a considerable amount of medication in her blood, but no mention of any abnormally high doses of an hallucinogen. She stared at the list of drugs, but apart from a water tablet, they meant nothing to her. She cursed again. From Mr. Matthews' description of what he had heard, Nikki could have sworn that Amelia was not arguing, but having a bad trip, shouting at demons. That would have answered the problem of no one else having been seen and the dog not barking. But why didn't the drugs show up in her blood? Maybe it was rehypnol type, one that did not stay in the system for long. She pushed the file to one side. That could be it, but she needed Professor Rory Wilkinson to confirm it. Nikki's hand hung over the phone, then she stopped. Best to check out the PM on Paul Cousins first. She scanned the report, but could find nothing from toxicology. With a small snort of irritation, she went through it again. Everything else was there, except the tox screen. Shit! The one report she really needed had vanished into the wonderful Never-Never Land of Gone Missing. "Food's here, Mom." Joseph's voice calmed her somewhat. "Shall I bring it in?" Nikki stood up. "No, I'll come out there. I'm just about to start dusting the ceiling with these old reports." "Sorry about that. I'm not doing too badly, actually." He set out several foil food trays on his desk and pulled the lids off. "Smells good." He passed her a fork. "I don't think the super has too much to worry about with these statistics, you know. Whoever compiled them in the first place should be shot. On closer examination, they've admitted to take into consideration a lot of regional variables, and I suspect that part of it is compiled by estimates based on out-of-date trends, so, to be honest, Joseph, speak English, and pass the soy sauce, please." She took the sachet from him and tore it open. "What you were saying is that the survey is crap, is that right?" "You do have a remarkable way with words, Mom, but in a nutshell, yes." "And you can prove that statement?" "I should be able to. In fact, given a little longer, I can probably produce some pretty convincing data." "Just enough to get the